Welcome to this week's Rising Tide Foundation lecture, where I'm very happy that once again we have our good friend Marty Sieff, who has pitched in. He threw an idea at me that I thought was solid. Cynthia was scheduled originally to give a presentation today, but she got pulled into another project, so she will be doing a thing on the American system, but it won't be today. However, it'll come. Now, Marty, being somebody who's able to compose thoroughly composed, creative presentations on the fly, was able to sweep in and provide a wonderful pitch of a concept that's going to tie some of the idiotic ideas that nearly destroyed human civilization a century ago and today's world in a way that I think will help us to learn a lot of lessons about what not to do in a time of crisis. Marty, I think everyone knows you. They know your style. So you just free flow as you wish. I've got the video here if you want me to play a video at some point. And when you're done, we'll open up for dialogue. So it's all yours.
Okay, hang on, folks. Let's go back to the beginning. I apologize in advance if this is even more chaotic and free-ranging than usual, because it does cover a vast area. But it's on one level, at the overt, obvious, superficial level, of course, it's a discussion of world history and politics, primarily European, but also East Asian, from 100 years ago, from 1918 through to 1939. It's the story of Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations. But most of all, it's a story of a belief system. It's a wave of belief that we see again 100 years later today. Because we are talking about a vast secular religion that would promise world peace in our time. And they had a Prince of Peace who was revered on a colossal scale that neither Jesus nor Moses would have aspired to in their own time. A man who was literally worshipped by hundreds of millions of people for bringing the perfect solution for the global problems of the world. In fact, of course, the opposite was the case. He created them. He made World War II inevitable. He made the most terrible genocides in both Europe and East Asia inevitable as a direct consequence of his actions. His name was Woodrow Wilson. He creates the dream of a shining city on a hill, which we see again today. Glorious parliament of man that will solve all the problems of the world peacefully, that will make war obsolete. And this was believed. It was believed by the publics of the West, especially less so in France, certainly not in Germany or Italy, but to a great degree in America, but much more than America in Britain. And there was also for me, and I think there will be for you too, some very unexpected twists and ironies to this. We are used to tracing the iniquity and the manipulation and the cynicism and the success of British financial interests over the past 400 years in literally enslaving and raping the world. And they did so. And most of you were here for one of my recent presentations on Lord Palmerston, the man who succeeded where Hitler failed in literally raping the whole world. Africa, South America, China, India, Russia, all across Eurasia. The only part of the world Palmerston did not bother with was the Middle East, because oil hadn't been discovered and it wasn't worth his while. But today we are going to look at an opposite phenomenon. Because the British have been so successful in the past, and today as well, in manipulating the world in the most greedy and genocidal and rapacious ways, we assume they always operate that way and they're always successful in doing so. But we are going to look at a period in the 1920s and 30s when the British descended into an era of literal stupidity and naivete and madness. And the naivete was so total that even at the time, a large number of informed observers across America and Germany and the Soviet Union and even France could not believe they meant it, believed that it had to be a cover for a much more cynical, deep game. And there were certainly different cynical, deep players as we all know, active in London and in British politics and the British financial circles at that time. But they were not driving events. The people who were driving events, including large numbers of the ruling class, as we shall see, were delusional idiots. And they had fallen for their own pious dream of world peace. And it came, in fact, from something which is very familiar to everyone here. And it's an area, ironically, although I have to touch on because it's real and fascinates me, but I don't know that much about. And I hope there will be time in the questions for many of you, or most of you, to contribute in full. And that is the occult origins of the dream of world peace and the League of Nations. Because Theosophy is involved, H.G. Wells is involved, George Bernard Shaw is involved, Buddhism is involved, Tibetan monks are to an amazing degree involved. But it starts, although the idea is not original with him, he was not an original thinker, the crucial prophet and Prince of Peace who declares the dream of the end of war and the coming of at the end of World War I and the creation of a League of Nations which will make war obsolete is, of course, our old friend Thomas Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States of America. Now, to see the League of Nations is not to be compared with the United Nations. That's a condemnation of the United Nations. There's a lot that's wrong with the United Nations, a lot that's sinister that operates within under the framework of the United Nations, as we shall also see. But that's not the direct parallel. Here is what you have to understand. The League of Nations is set up as a vision of a parliament of man that will promote actively the creation of democracy, total peace, total justice across the whole world. It will be a one world government. It will make war obsolete. There will be open borders. There will be free trade. But democracy will be defined as we in the League choose to define democracy. And if democracy is, the League will not even have to resort to war, because the moral power of 30 or 40 or 50 nations alone pushing the ideas of democracy and free trade and open markets and liberal capitalism have obviously triumphed at the end of World War I. Is this starting to sound familiar? Is this starting to sound topical? Of course it should. But as Jesus rightly says, by their fruits shall you know them. Jesus, again, is not a sweet, loving fellow who just wants people to be kind to each other, which of people as influential as Douglas Adams, who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, described as, he said Jesus was nailed to a cross because he simply said people should be kind to each other. That's an ignorant, idiotic lie. The fool never read the Gospels. He never read the Gospels. Jesus says, I come not to bring peace, but I come to set us with a sword. I'm going to set man against man, and a man against his family. And again, he who puts his parents above me is not worthy of me, and he who puts his children above me is not worthy of me. This is the way actual real cult leaders actually also speak. But it's also the way revolutionary leaders speak, and it's the way horribly tough-minded, frighteningly tough-minded leaders speak when they say, if you are serious about a really radical idea, whether it is good or bad, you are going to push it all the way, regardless of what it does to your happiness, to your personal ties, to your family, to anything. This is Jesus. He is like Lincoln. He has his compassionate, deeply compassionate side, but he also has this dynamic, frightening, ruthless, hard-driving side, which is why he wins. And as I've said before, he hangs out with Roman centurions. Half of his sayings, the sweet, lovable sayings, echo the highest form of ethical teaching from the Jewish rabbis of the time. But the other half of his sayings come from a very different background completely. He hangs out with Roman centurions all the time, senior combat officers of the Roman army. Thomas Woodrow Wilson did not. As we shall see, whenever Wilson was given advice by the leading American generals and strategists of his day, he ignored it. And scores of millions of human beings died, and hundreds of millions more and billions of human beings suffered as a result. The League of Nations was doomed from the start, but it had the highest hopes imaginable because it had been blessed as by the Prince of Peace. I do not say this lightly. When Woodrow Wilson came to Europe at the beginning of 1919, January 1919, on board the liner SS George Washington, he was greeted in France, in Italy, and in Britain with the most popular demonstrations in the history of the human race. 2 million human beings at least turned out for him in Paris, 3 times the number who welcomed Charles Lindbergh for the genuine achievement of flying the Atlantic. 8 years later, the French loved the Americans passionately, even then. In Britain, the figures were even larger. In Milan, in Italy, 3 million human beings turned out and is regarded as a greater turnout of popular support and acclamation than any Roman emperor had ever received. And Woodrow Wilson took it seriously. So he comes to the Paris Peace Conference. This treaty is signed in Versailles, but all the negotiations are carried out in Paris. And he does everything the wrong way. When Harry Truman went to Potsdam in 1945, and earlier in 1945, when President Franklin Roosevelt drew up the lines of Europe that maintained peace in Europe for the next stability and recovery for the next 80 years, only 3 individuals were involved, really 2.5. Stalin and Roosevelt, and grumbling and grouching and not understanding what was going on, and as usual, drunk and depressed most of the time, Winston Churchill was there too. But he was a lightweight, and both Roosevelt and Stalin at the time despised him, which you never see in British historiography, and you don't see in modern American historiography either, not at all, because Churchill is a bigger god in America today than he was in Britain. We see a paradoxical situation in 1919, where Woodrow Wilson was a far bigger god in Britain and Europe than he ever was in the United States of America, where he had been rejected in the 1918 congressional elections, and where the Senate refused to ratify the Versailles Treaty and also refused to approve U.S. entry into the League of Nations. So Wilson comes to Paris, and instead of 3 or 2.5 leaders deciding the fate of the world, there are 33 governments and quasi-government forces, all of which Wilson insists must have their say. So the result is chaos. And Wilson is a miserable administrator. Remember, he only went into politics 2 years before he became president. He was a notoriously unsuccessful and controversial president of Princeton University. He's then cynically picked by the party bosses as a supposedly clean figure to be governor of New Jersey. He can't even govern the state of New Jersey, which is quite easy to govern. And he gets kicked upstairs, and because that other idiot, Theodore Roosevelt, splits the Republican majority in the United States that has existed since the Civil War, Wilson is able to crawl in between a split Republican vote that is split between incumbent President William Howard Taft and former President Theodore Roosevelt. So he scrapes in as an accidental president in 1912. By 1919, he's been president for 7 years. He's brought in many reforms, almost all of which are catastrophes. He brings in the Federal Reserve, which is meant to avoid depression. The worst depression in American history comes within 4 years of the creation of the Federal Reserve as a direct result of the Fed misreading and misunderstanding the nature of demand and artificially pushing up interest rates right after World War I. And it's the worst depression in American history until it's cleared up by Woodrow Wilson's despised successor, President Warren Harding. And Harding is never given credit for any of this, and Wilson is never given blame for any of this. But that's how he gets to be president. He's arrogant. He treats the Congress like dirt. He has no friends in the Congress. He particularly makes an enemy of the key driving force who runs the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which is vital to the ratification of any international treaty and obligation the United States enters. And is a very sinister figure in his own right, our old friend Henry Cabot Lodge Sr. But Wilson should be trying to get on with him, because that's what political leaders are supposed to do in a democracy. You cut deals. You don't get everything you want, but you keep the machinery of government working. And you get at least 49% or hopefully 51% of what you want, but you have to give the other guy something too. Wilson never does this. He's a binary man. He's a zero-sum man. He refuses to even meet with Lodge or treat him with respect, and this is one of the most powerful figures in the United States. And as a result, the qualifications to preserve American sovereignty that even Lodge requires as necessary. Lodge is not opposed to joining the League of Nations, and he is not opposed to signing the Versailles Treaty. But he says we must not bind the United States to a one-world supranational force. We must maintain American sovereignty, and therefore there have to be qualifications put in this treaty to preserve American sovereignty. Now, although Lodge is a sinister, evil SOB, the terms he makes here are actually moderate terms. They are so moderate that a quarter of a century later, President Franklin Roosevelt insists on precisely these caveats as conditions for the United States joining and supporting the United Nations, the successor to the League of Nations, a quarter of a century later. And the Senate, after World War II, ratifies this and has no problem pushing through this. But then Franklin Roosevelt always worked hard to cooperate constructively, even with objectionist, isolationist leaders in the Republican Party at the time. He understood the American system. He understood the way American democracy worked and was meant to work. And he worked within those parameters. And actually, at first, so did his successor, President Harry Truman. Truman's very problematic later record comes with, he starts shifting to the creation of a very sinister deep state government within 2 years of the end of the war. And he allows the purging of the OSS and the creation of the truly sinister CIA with its umbilical links to organized crime, because he's oblivious to most of this, and has been a beneficiary of much of it as being a creature of the Prendergast party machine, the most corrupt in America, in Kansas City in his time. He's personally honest, but he knows when to look in the opposite direction. Other Democratic so-called moral leaders like Barack Obama and Adlai Stevenson and John Kennedy in their day have also been good at doing that. I mean, Republicans too, but Republicans, of course, are more honest in the corruption. They're not hypocrites. They're just openly dishonest. Democrats like to sound virtuous at the same time. But because of all of this, Woodrow Wilson bungles American politics. He has already lost the November 1918 congressional elections. He comes to Paris acclaimed as the great world leader and Prince of Peace, and yet he has been politically repudiated by his own electorate in a free democratic election right at the end of the war in November 1918 in the midterm congressional elections. That's the first crucial flaw in what Wilson does. The second crucial flaw is, at Versailles, as I say, he doesn't simply sit down with the leaders of Russia and the British Empire and France. He drives Russia out of the whole caboodle. He refuses to deal with the Soviet Union and its new leader, Vladimir Lenin, at all. By contrast, of course, Franklin Roosevelt works for world peace consistently and systematically and remarkably successfully in dealing with Joseph Stalin, who was no saint, who was no liberal, who was not a good man, who had at least as much blood in his hands as Adolf Hitler himself did. But for the sake of the world and the survival of the world, Franklin Roosevelt does not give up fundamental American interests, but he recognizes the need to cut deals with and negotiate with and treat with respect and interact with Joseph Stalin. Wilson never does that with Vladimir Lenin and the Soviet Lenin and the Soviet leaders in 1918, 1919. He anathemizes them. And in fact, he alienates one of his own most brilliant and previously most passionately loyal supporters, veteran diplomat Bill Bullitt, who will later write a book attacking the very idea that Wilson was sane. He psychoanalyzes Wilson later in a book that to this day you cannot buy in the United States of America in its unexpurgated form. You are not allowed to read what Sigmund Freud and Bill Bullitt wrote about Woodrow Wilson in the United States for 100 years to this day. There is a very good book by Patrick Weil, called The Madman in the White House, if anybody wants to take a note of it. Well worth checking up, which quotes from this book extensively and documents it and explains how Freud, from his psychoanalytical perspective, and Bill Bullitt, from his diplomatic perspective and knowing Wilson so well personally, document the literal megalomania and insanity of the President of the United States, even before he has a stroke, when he comes to Versailles and Paris in 1919. Third, as I said before, Wilson opens the Paris conference to every group imaginable. 33 governments and quasi-government forces all have equal say and equal access to the president at Versailles. They are all part of the same decision-making process. Russia is not involved. The American army is going home. Wilson has been repudiated by his own Senate and Congress. The army is returning immediately. There is no American muscle and there is no Soviet muscle to enforce the peace treaty. It is left to Britain and France. But Britain and France have each lost millions of dead and cripples for life in World War I and are exhausted, and their publics will not tolerate renewed conscription or a commitment to enforcing the peace of the world or the peace of Europe as Wilson visualizes it. So he redraws the map of Europe in a way nobody has redrawn it for 1,000 years. He redraws it badly. From the very beginning, he is ignored when, as I said before, 5 different organized state groups become mini fascist conquerors and enslave their neighbors immediately. And this is 14 years before Hitler ever comes to power. It happens in 1919. The Czechs enslave the Slovaks. Hold on a moment, remind me later. The Czechs enslave the Slovaks, and the Slovak people are enslaved to a degree even more intense and contemptuous and vicious than African Americans were enslaved in the United States before the Civil War in the antebellum era. And this is completely ignored because the French, to some degree, and the British overwhelmingly love the Czechs so much. And because Thomas Masaryk, founding president of Czechoslovakia, is a wonderful con artist. William Bullitt brings to the president's attention that peace between Czechoslovakia, the new state, and Germany is impossible because the Czechs have already occupied against their will the Sudetenland with 3 to 5 million German inhabitants, and they are oppressing them mercilessly. And Wilson is astonished by this. He did not know. And Wilson's reaction is enormously revealing, which Bullitt records. But there are 5 million Czechs in the Sudetenland? Why did President Masaryk not inform me of this? Why did President Masaryk not inform me of this? In other words, you are dealing with a naive idiot. He assumes that because he is Wilson, the all-powerful, the all-wise, the all-virtuous, he really is the Messiah. Everyone will tell him the truth. The concept that people will lie to him, or that he will be piss ignorant of the most elementary facts of Europe, never having been anywhere in it, are totally alien to him. He is an academic professor of the theory of government, which means he knows nothing about human beings or about the way government actually works, or how business works, or how human beings think, or how ordinary human beings even lie to each other. He's a fool. And the peoples of Europe are going to be crucified for the next 30 years on the cross of Woodrow Wilson's self-righteousness. So there are 5 groups that enslave their neighbors already at and immediately after the Versailles Peace Treaty. They are the Czechs enslaving the Slovaks. They are the Poles enslaving the Jews. The Ukrainians, the Russians, the Lithuanians, the Slovaks, and most of all, the Germans to their west. The Polish murder and rape and persecution of German minorities in what had previously been Germany, in what became the Polish corridor, is so great in 1920 that the poor Germans there, being actually peaceful and believing Wilson's promises, appealed to the League of Nations to protect them from their new Polish government. And of course, the League of Nations does SFA. I think all of you know the meaning of that. For any tender-minded people who may be watching who always complain I use too foul Irish language, I will not translate it. If you have the guts to look it up and you don't know what it means, Google will supply. But they know that the League of Nations does not raise a well-manicured fingernail. And the first complaint to the League of Nations about the injustice of the Versailles Treaty comes from Germans who are being murdered and raped and despoiled and having their property stolen and burned to the ground in pogroms by the Poles as early as 1919, 1920. That's the second group. The third group is the Romanians, the largest sex trafficking and corrupt nation in Europe, which Woodrow Wilson knows nothing about, curs leis. Winston Churchill is a great favors the Romanians greatly. He regards himself as a Balkans expert. He wrote a very bad romantic novel, but a very revealing one called Savrola in 1901, 1902, around that time. And it's a huge, first fictions usually are. It's very revealing about the man himself, much more than his own formal autobiography or histories, when he knows he's supposed to tell the truth and therefore he lies. But in his fiction, he tells the truth. A romantic hero who leads a revolution and forces open a dramatic strait, just like the Dardanelles in Gallipoli, and becomes the great hero savior of his people, though he's actually just a romantic twit. That's Churchill's very revealing, the only novel he ever wrote, Savrola. Churchill's the expert on the Balkans. So he gives the Romanians a free hand to enslave their Jews, and Romanian savagery against their Jewish population is so great that in World War II, even Nazis are appalled and amazed by the ferocity of what the Romanians do to their Jews. Most of all, they enslave the Hungarian and German minorities in Transylvania that have lived there prosperously and in peace with each other with no Romanian interaction whatsoever. The Romanians regarded as barbarous savages who impaled people on stakes by the tens of thousands, which they had previously done so, most especially under Vlad Dracula in the 15th century, but the tradition continued afterwards. And it is to these people from the barbarous East that the civilized Hungarian and German minorities of the Habsburg Empire are thrown to the wolves by Churchill and the other great peacemakers in Versailles. But Churchill also creates modern Yugoslavia, which means he creates the modern Yugoslav Civil War, which in turn was the turning point that convinced President Bill Clinton and that NATO had to expand endlessly eastward to guarantee peace in Europe, even if it risked nuclear war with Russia. I covered this personally hands-on at close hand as State Department correspondent for the Washington Times from 1992 to 1999. I couldn't have had a closer seat for it. And I saw this process take place. You had a rather hands-off, cautious isolationist, rather a very nice man, but a terrible Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, who did not want the United States to be involved in European conflicts at all. Neither did Clinton. Clinton didn't either. But Clinton was appalled by the bloodbaths in Yugoslavia, which came as a direct result of the boundaries that Winston Churchill, more than any other leader, even more than Woodrow Wilson, imposed towards the Serbs in 1919. A Yugoslav state was created that was really a Serb empire that mercilessly enslaved westernized Catholic Croats and Slovenes and Bosnian Muslims alike. And even the Orthodox Christian of Montenegro, the White Mountain, who are a very independent people, loathed the Serbian overlordship. Tito, with all his ruthlessness and murderous communist ways after World War II, was actually much more democratic and humane and politically sensitive. He was a Croat himself. And therefore, while he was alive, he actually made a liberal communist or a liberal socialist, quasi-communist Yugoslavia apparently work. And I traveled there extensively in the 1970s. But as soon as he died, it all fell apart. And of course, then you had these, not one, but 6 different civil wars in Yugoslavia exploding from 1992 to 1995. And it was the ferocity of these wars, which actually were a direct result of Winston Churchill and Woodrow Wilson and the Versailles Treaty back in 1919, the borders being reimposed. And it was this that impelled the historic shift. Clinton in his second term replaces do-nothing Secretary of State Warren Christopher with very activist, stupid, dangerous, holier than thou Madeleine Albright, who is Czech and Jewish, though she hides the Jewish part, hates communism like poison, hates the Russian people like poison, and is a creature of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is the Polish aristocrat, who I knew very well personally. And I was his favorite foreign correspondent in Washington for the first 6 years. I was in Washington because I was reporting more aggressively than anyone else on the disintegration of the Soviet system. But there was a difference between us, of course, even then. I recognized the Soviet system was collapsing, and I was very happy to see that. But I was never personally anti-Russian. Brzezinski was genocidal to the day he died about Russians, not about Jews, not about Arabs, not about black people. He recommended Barack Obama to David Rockefeller as a future president of the United States. He opened the way for Obama. Of course, one of the reasons was that Obama was totally ignorant of foreign policy except for anything Brzezinski told him to believe, and therefore he must be a genius in Brzezinski's eyes. But it was Brzezinski who said to David Rockefeller, "This is the acceptable black leader we need. This is the man who is brilliant in foreign policy because he follows everything I tell him to do." And as a result, Joe Biden, of course, in the same path, and leads us to where we are today. But it all goes back to 1919, it all goes back to Churchill, and most of all, it all goes back to Woodrow Wilson. Now, Wilson, it literally breaks his health and destroys what is left of his sanity because he is working 18 hours a day at the Versailles Peace Conference. He has no staff with him whatsoever. He sees everyone. He thinks he's smarter than everyone else and nobody can understand anything as well as him. He never delegates anything. He has a very responsible and able and energetic and intelligent Secretary of State in Robert Lansing. He humiliates Lansing. He ignores him totally. He ignores the State Department totally. By contrast, President Franklin Roosevelt, who is a master at delegation, is already a physically dying man, though he's mentally still as clear as a bell at Yalta. And he therefore focuses very specifically on the key issues of war and peace that he must deal with Stalin, while reining in Churchill and preventing Churchill from wrecking the world yet again, which is not easy. And he succeeds in these missions because he knows how to prioritize. When Harry Truman, who has been given nothing about foreign policy in the presidency, comes to Potsdam, he does not let 1,000,005 obscure little leaders from every little horseshit hole in Europe to have personal time with him to argue with him. He focuses on dealing with Stalin, to a lesser degree with Churchill. He takes time off by himself and he brings with him several thousand pages of briefing papers from the United States government along with the support staff for them so he can be briefed up fully on the issues and what Franklin Roosevelt did and what Franklin Roosevelt didn't do and what the previous recommendations of both President Roosevelt and the government bureaucracy was. Truman, remember, is fresh to the presidency, but he has served in the Senate for 10 years. He is not a stranger to the ways of administration. He is not a stranger to the ways of government. And after 7 years in the White House, Woodrow Wilson was. Now, at the risk of disrupting my usual chaotic natural flow, I lined up a couple of quotes for once. This is a book by a wonderful writer called Gene Smith, a wonderful popular historian with the poetic and literary gifts of an Evelyn Waugh or a Jane Austen or even a Dostoevsky. He is that good. I think he's dead now, more's the pity. But he wrote wonderful books about Herbert Hoover, about Neville Chamberlain, and here about Woodrow Wilson. And it's called When the Cheering Stopped. And he's sympathetic to Wilson, which, as I think you all know by now, I am not. But here is the paradox of what Wilson unleashed upon himself to deal with at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Europe was consumed by more than a score of violent territorial disputes between Russia and Sweden, Belgium and Holland, who heard of that one, Italy and Yugoslavia, Albania and Greece, the Czechs and the Poles, the Romanians and the Hungarians, like I said, the others. In the Far East and in Africa, the cry was the same. The peace treaty must give justice. The lands and reparations must be equally distributed. All wrongs must be righted. And then Gene Smith continues, however, how had Woodrow Wilson prepared for this? The President of the United States had no corps of assistants, no body of assistants trailing along with him. Sometimes he took a particular expert to sit beside him. Usually he sat alone, as he talked and argued with the other great men. All day and night the conferences over the fate of the world went on. And in between, there came to see him delegations to tell of their troubles, which he, of course, would cure. Who did he see? The Committee of Mutilated and Wounded Soldiers of Milan from Italy, the National Union of Railwaymen from England, the Worshipful Company of Plumbers of London. All of these people distracted and exhausted the President of the United States in his mission to, as he imagined, to bring world peace in Paris in 1919. He met the Prince of Siam and a delegation from the Carpathian Mountains, the president of the Provisional Government of Albania. This is just like the delusion of assistant secretaries of state for European and Eurasian affairs today in the US government, who spend all their ignore China, ignore Russia, but they're rewriting the traffic regulations of North Macedonia and Montenegro every day. They're very proud of this. They insist on North Macedonia not being a name that offends Greece, and having a very good traffic code and fitting the State Department standards on universal human rights. And of course, we know how much America respects human rights in Gaza and Ukraine and Syria and Libya and many other countries of the world, don't we? There was no end to the problems the European brought. The president worked and conferred, often holding several meetings in different rooms at the same time. Well, sure, that's a way to get things done and keep on top of things, but no amount of work could change reality, which was that no country, no matter how enormous it was, would get all that it wanted. Wow, isn't that amazing? Never mind, it finally dawns even on Woodrow Wilson that the peace treaty is not going to be perfect. Wow, comes as a shock to him. But no worry, he has a solution. The League of Nations. Yes, he says to the persecuted Germans of Poland, yes, homes may be burned and your children may be murdered and your wives may be raped. Yes, to the hundreds of thousands of Jews who are being slaughtered in the Russian Civil War. No, we do not have any American army to protect you, and we are not sending German troops to protect you as they did during World War I. The Jews of Ukraine were more protected by the German army during World War I than they ever were by the British, French, and American armies after the war had been won. Think about that. You're bringing universal peace, and you have no mechanism to enforce it. So instead of a tiny democratic Poland, which Wilson has been assured is all Poland wants by the Pianist Paderewski, who he admires, a Polish fascist general, Joseph Pilsudski, seizes power in Poland And Poland becomes a conquering power 9 times the size Woodrow Wilson originally approved for it. But of course, he goes along with it. In the Mediterranean and the Middle East, the situation is even worse. Winston Churchill loves passionately. Churchill is an amazing judge of great men. He always loves assholes and has withering contempt for truly able world leaders. And over 50 years, it never fails. So Churchill is convinced Prime Minister Eleutherios Venizelos, there's a name to remember. Who remembers Eleftherios Venizelos today outside Greece? Nobody wants to remember him for very good reasons in Greece itself, right, as we shall see. But to Churchill, he is one of the great men in human history. 25 years later, at the end of World War II, Churchill is still fond of quoting the wisdom of Eleftherios Venizelos. What does the Prime Minister of Greece, Eleftherios Venizelos, do with Churchill's full support? He invades Turkey. Now, there are 7 million Greeks. There are 13 million Turks. This is not quite as delusionally insane as Netanyahu and 7 million Israelis, imagining that they will humiliate and destroy and force to unconditional surrender 92 million Iranians. But it's bad enough, especially since the Greek army is no good at all. And Churchill, whose British and Australian armies had been squandered in rivers of blood, costing 200,000 lives in the completely messed up and futile Gallipoli campaign of 1915, should have known by then that the Turks are a great and proud warrior people, and they will fight for their survival, and they will fight for their dignity, and they will win, and they do. And when the Greek attempt to enslave and occupy and neo-colonize Turkey, Asia Minor, fails, Turkish vengeance is overwhelming. The Christian Greek Orthodox communities in Asia Minor have lived in peace and security under the Ottoman Empire for 500 years, so much so that they actually rose up against the Catholic Holy League in the 17th century to protect, in support of the Muslim Turkish Empire, because they were terrified of being enslaved by the Western Catholic forces of Venice, a familiar name, and Genoa, and the Spanish Empire. They support the Turks instead. But now they have been alienated to the Turks, and the Turks are really angry. And so communities that go back 3,000 years are totally annihilated. Hundreds of thousands of Greeks are killed. And more than 500,000 Greeks have to be rescued by the British and French navies. And it is the end of 3,000 years, or 3,500 years, of Greek civilization in the Ionian Islands and in the Ionian mainland of Asia Minor. And the one Western leader, even more than Wilson, who is directly responsible for this catastrophe, is our old friend, Winston Churchill, backed by David Lloyd George as Prime Minister at the time. Because they think that the Turks, they're Arabs, they're dark-skinned, they're not Europeans, they're not a pure white race, they don't bring pure European civilization the way the Greeks do. This is the very simplistic, racist way these people are thinking at the time. And they never learn. They never learn. But as I say, not to worry, because Wilson has the same answer for the National Union of Railwaymen from Britain, as he does for the trade unionists of London, as he does for the Provisional Government of Albania, as he does for the persecuted and terrified Jews of Ukraine, or Germans of Western Poland, or the enslaved Slovaks at the hand of the merciless Czechs. Not to worry. Take your problems to the League of Nations. The League will solve everything. And people believe him. Now we come to the next paradox. The League is set up. It is set up in Geneva. It is enormously popular among the war-weary populations of Europe. It is even popular at first in Italy, though that fades quickly. It is hugely popular in France and Britain. At first, it is even popular in Germany. Enormous wealth is poured into the creating of the Palais des Nations, the Palace of Nations in Geneva. Do we have any? I mean, it's not a must map, but do we have any pictures we can put up of the Palais de Nation, of the Palace of Nations in Geneva?
It'll take me about 30 seconds, so you can keep talking, and
Right.
then I'll pull something off.
Good idea, exactly. And I'd like you to see this because the scale of this is enormous. They start building it in 1929. There's a bureaucracy involved, so although the League is already 9 years old, starting functioning in 1920, work on its home doesn't really begin until 1929. This is typical of the League. Work on it is only finished in 1938, a year before World War II begins. And as we shall see, the League has been a dark joke since 1931. But people believe in it. Now then, people believe. Yeah, take a look at that. Isn't that like, Rome at the height of its conquest, all powerful, the capital of the world? Will anyone dare declare war against an organization with a headquarters and a capital like that? Look at all these pictures. Wow. The finest Carrara marble from Italy, the finest cedars of Lebanon wood that were used in the Temple of Solomon from Lebanon are also brought to
Oh,
build this.
I feel like I'm not showcasing the same. Is this the correct one? This one has more of
No,
a an Art
all the
Deco
correct ones,
Roman.
because no, you
Like,
were right all along, Matt, because this is a
oh,
huge complex, and the pictures are of different parts of the complex. It
hmm.
is a much larger complex. It doesn't go as high in the sky, of course, but this is a vast complex that is added to over the years. And of course, it becomes dead as a dodo in 1939. But not to worry. Any more that you'd like to show, feel free to show. Otherwise, I think exactly the point is made. It's still active today because it's taken over by the United Nations. And to this day, 6,000 conferences a year, an average of 20 conferences a day under the auspices of the United Nations, are held in the old headquarters of the League of Nations in Geneva. Why are they held there and not New York? First of all, there's a space and room for them. But secondly, Congress and what's left of the American media and the very skeptical public in New York City are not there to see it. It's one world government. We don't know what most of these conferences are about. 6,000 different multi-day conferences a year under the UN at Geneva alone with no accountability. What is going on there? The answer is obviously a lot of things, one way or another, are going on there. I have no answers for you, but I pose the question. But you see, again, this is a system that did not die in 1939. It actually died in 1931. But it has been resurrected since. But so far, we've just talked about Wilson's vision. But Wilson has a disabling stroke in 1919 as President of the United States. The most powerful man in the world basically has to wear diapers and colonoscopy bags for his last 18 months as President of the United States. And in free America, nobody, although a few Republicans complain about this, they are dismissed by the responsible media, especially the New York Times, of course, as being conspiracy mongers and slanderers, and nobody looks. The Cabinet of the United States stays silent. The Vice President, Thomas Marshall, is an amiable, useless nonentity who is terrified by the thought of being president and would rather have a drooling, clinically insane, paralyzed invalid whose diapers need to be changed several times a day for him in the White House than take over the functions of being a responsible president of the United States himself. While this is going on, America collapses in the most violent race riots in its history, far worse than anything happened in the 1960s or the late 1980s. The American economy goes into a free fall that is more extreme and dangerous than the first 2 years of the Great Depression from 1929 to 1930, from which it has to be rescued by President Warren Harding. and his administration afterwards. And they provide the fastest and most successful recovery from a full-scale economic crisis and depression in the entire economic history of the United States. And they get no credit for it, of course. To this day, every liberal historian and every know-nothing reader of the New York Times on the US East Coast, or of the Guardian, or the Times of London, or the Daily Telegraph in London will have a supercilious sneer for Warren G. Harding from Ohio, and have the highest reverence and respect for the great liberal visionary, the saintly President Woodrow Wilson. So America literally collapses. There is also a collapse of the rule of law. The Constitution is virtually suspended. There is a fear of communist revolution in America. It's total hysteria. There is no truth to it. But Attorney General Palmer organizes what he calls the Palmer raids, and thousands of people are arrested and thrown into federal prison indefinitely, without trial, without due process, until Warren Harding sets them free. For more than 18 months, Eugene Debs, who had been the socialist candidate for president of the United States in 1912, and against Wilson and against Theodore Roosevelt, polled more than 1 million votes, the highest figure any socialist or serious left leader, at least until AOC runs in 2028, has ever polled in a mainstream American election. And he's thrown into Leavenworth Penitentiary, and his health is wrecked, so he dies a premature death several years later. And who frees Warren G. Harding from this jail? Not the great liberal saint of peace, Woodrow Wilson, the Joe Biden of his day. No, that evil Donald Trump of his day, the well-known, selfish, evil fascist Warren Harding, who not only frees Debs, an entirely innocent man, from jail, but invites him to dinner in the White House to show that he is a fully accepted and honored American citizen and political leader again. The Republican right-wing president invites the leading socialist in America to dinner in the White House after freeing him from federal penitentiary in which Woodrow Wilson had thrown him. And what does Woodrow Wilson then say when he is asked to explain his actions? He quotes the Gospels. He says, I find no, I paraphrase slightly here, feel free to correct me, but he says, I find no sin, I find no wrong in this man. I find no wrong in this man. So between the evil Republican reactionary fascist Warren Harding and the great liberal visionary Prince of Peace internationalist Democrat Woodrow Wilson, a man who of course resegregated the federal government, throwing tens of thousands of honorable black citizens out of work and impoverishing their families, until again Warren G. Harding reversed that action and desegregated the federal government a second time. This was Woodrow Wilson. But remember, Wilson has bungled domestic politics too. The Senate has not ratified the Versailles Treaty. It has not ratified and approved the United States entering the League of Nations. The United States never enters the League of Nations. So here is the League of Nations, and it is going to impose world peace. And the country where this is most passionately believed is not America. It is widely believed in America by the intellectual liberal classes, very widely believed. But there is a paradox here. The country which most embraces the League of Nations, along with its leaders, is Britain. And it is many of the heirs of the old ruling class of Britain, with aristocratic connections in the British steep date going back 400 years, who embrace the League. Now, you would expect this to mean that they are planning to use the League as a cynical tool to project British power. But they're not, because there is a huge debate going on in British government at the time. There are many hard-headed, ruthless leaders in the British government, like Lord Curzon, like Sir Eyre Crowe, the permanent Undersecretary at the Foreign Office in charge of shaping British foreign policy and global strategy, Sir Maurice Hankey, the top military advisor to the Prime Ministers of Britain, who was Secretary to the Committee of Imperial Defence, and they are horrified at the British commitment to the League, because it is open-ended and it is supposedly altruistic. And they know that Britain is already exhausted. They want Britain to continue running the world. Of course they do. But they also know they have lost 1 million dead in World War One, 3 million more seriously injured. The Australians are traumatized because Winston Churchill has sent so many of their boys to their death. The percentage deaths of Australians and New Zealand's relative to population in World War One is higher than the percentage death tolls in France or Germany or even Russia. And one man is responsible: Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill. And this will have huge repercussions in World War II when Australia loses again tens of thousands of soldiers to be tortured to death as prisoners mercilessly in Japanese prison camps when Churchill sends them to Singapore and assures the Australian government Singapore will never fall and Singapore is defenseless. When, against the pleas of the Australian government, he sends Australian divisions into Greece when his own top generals have told him they do not have a chance against the German army when the German army moves into the rest of Eastern Europe, especially down in Greece. And Churchill ignores all this, and of course he takes no blame for it whatsoever afterwards. For anybody who wants to see the story of how Australia throws the British Empire overboard in World War II because the British Empire is criminally incompetent and keeps lying to Australia in World War II. And it is Churchill, most of all, who does it. It's on YouTube. You can rewatch it for free. There was a remarkable show made 40 years ago, remarkable cast, called The Last Bastion. You have to write this down because you never think of what it was about otherwise. And it is the story of John Curtin, Curtin, who Prime Minister of Australia through World War II, who refuses to bow down to Winston Churchill's bullying. And he brings the Australian army home from the Middle East against every effort and threat by Churchill not to do so. And Churchill hates Curtin. In Churchill's war memoirs, Curtin does not exist. He treats Curtin with withering contempt. Curtin had been a brave, conscientious objector to the wickedness of the war in World War I. He was a socialist. He was a Labour Party leader. He brings in and creates a full, successful, functioning welfare state in Australia, even while Australia is fighting World War II during the war. He makes the epic decision that Australia will never trust or rely upon Britain again, that its strategic ally in World War II and thereafter must be with the United States. And all of this is dramatized very accurately, extremely accurately. None of it is invented dialogue. It's all from official government records and documents. In this movie, The Last Bastion, there's some wonderfully quirky casting. The presentation of Winston Churchill by the wonderful British actor Timothy West, who specializes in playing brutal, right-of-center, stupid, repressive, horrible thugs. And of course, in real life, he was anything but. He was a very kindly, doting father. He was a very genuine liberal, principled left of center moderate in his politics. But he was a great talent, and he catches Churchill perfectly. And Churchill is always complaining, these are all ex-convicts, and they're all Irish. They're or cowards or socialists. There's no aristocratic quality to any of these Australians. They're the scum of the earth. What more can you expect from them? And he keeps lying to the Australians. Oh, all we want is, like he tries to lie to Franklin Roosevelt, oh, all we need is one of your divisions for Burma for just a few weeks. We won't keep it long. And then, of course, once he's got it there, he's going to keep it there for the rest of the war until the Japanese conquer it and enslave it because the British have left them in the lurch. And Curtin doesn't believe him. And Churchill is outraged that Curtin doesn't believe him. But Curtin faces the great macho Churchill down. And it's Churchill who has to bend and bow. But Curtin dies in harness for natural causes. He's always had a weak heart. He dies from overwork in 1945 before the war ends. And the Australian public responds to his memory by re-electing the Labour Party 4 times in a row in elections over the next 10 years. By contrast, Churchill is swept out of office in the biggest landslide humiliation in British political history in 1945. In 1945. Now, again, we're halfway around the world from where we start and where we go back to. But again, we get here via Turkey and via Churchill's miscalculations on the catastrophe that he inflicts on the Greek people as well as the Australian people against Turkey. like the Italian people in World War II. Other nations always suffer with hundreds of thousands or millions of needless dead so that Winston Churchill can sound like a pompous, heroic, wise little shit. And he'll use a phrase, the soft underbelly of the Axis. It is our stern duty to all pompous, empty fucking shit. It's like striking a match in the Hindenburg and it goes boom. It's all methane. It's all hot air. It all goes up. It is all absolutely worthless, as was the Versailles Treaty. So we are back to the League of Nations in the 1920s. This amazing new Temple of Solomon for world peace has been built. And the British upper class love this, and the British middle class love it too. Why do they love it? Because thanks to Winston Churchill and David Lloyd George and literally two of their friends, Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary, Britain is pulled into World War I to destroy Germany when there is no drive or need to do so. The Germans were not after the British Empire. The Kaiser was a fool and had built a large fleet to show that Germany was a power in the world. And it was an incredibly stupid thing to do because it alienated the British public. And it played into the hands of the real warmongers like Lloyd George and Haldane and Churchill himself. But the war is unleashed. 1 million British boys are killed outright. 3 million boys more are crippled so seriously, 1 million of them suffering the effects of mustard gas, so that they are all dead by the time they are 50 years old. So another 1 million people die from the effects of mustard gas in the 20 years after the war. Virtually everybody who suffered from it is dead by 1939. Because it's a lung disease, and even today it could not be effectively treated. And certainly at that time there was no hope. There was no hope. And these are the death toll in Britain, and to an even greater degree in France. So what do the British public want most of all? They want peace. They want world peace. They want an end to war. And the fool Woodrow Wilson has given them the hope of it. But it is an empty, worthless hope. But they do not realize this. But it is popular. A League of Nations union is founded in Britain in the early 1920s. In its first year, it gets 15,000 members. By the time it is 4 years old, it has 650,000 members. This is the equivalent of a mass movement with paying dues and an activist political base with 6.5 million activist members in the United States today. That would be the equivalent of. And nobody dares ignore it. And it sweeps popular culture as well. There is a movie. I'm not sure if we should. I've been looking in vain for it. There's lots of clips of it on YouTube, and you might want to look it up. It's a very famous movie called Lost Horizons, made in 1937. I think the best thing might be just. I think you're ahead of me again, Matt, to send the link out to everyone, because the whole movie is on YouTube. And the movie is made by and stars very significant people. It is an enormous global hit. Here is the plot. The Foreign Secretary of England, who's going to be the next Prime Minister of Britain, which means the British Empire, which, because India is still enslaved in the empire, means 400 million people, the leader of 400 million people, the hyperpower of the world, right, is the Foreign Secretary of Britain. He's young, he's handsome. He has the kind of effeminate, fragile handsomeness with a moustache that the English loved between the two world wars. And he wants world peace without having to fight a war. And he believes in the League of Nations. And he's the champion of the League of Nations. He's played by Ronald Colman. And he gets the girl, right? What could be more perfect? Now, he actually is not a fiction. The novel is by James Hilton. The movie is made by our old friend, Frank Capra. Now, Capra always means well. And he's a champion of peace and justice and decency. He really is. And he makes one masterpiece after another. And this movie is a masterpiece. But this one is a delusional masterpiece. First, the Foreign Secretary of Britain is not a fiction. He's simply a very slightly disguised presentation of the man who was Foreign Secretary of Britain at that time. Matt, can we put up a picture of Anthony Eden on the screen if we can find one? Preferably when he's young. There must be millions of them. This is a man who for 20 years on and off was Foreign Secretary of Britain, Winston Churchill's right-hand man, and then becomes Prime Minister of Britain. And he becomes the youngest foreign secretary in history in 1935, and he is dedicated to peace. And he's a hero of World War I. He was injured in World War I. He was an officer in the British Army. There's the man in his older age. You see, still handsome, still dashing. Right. Now let's have a picture, if we can, instead, of Ronald Colman as he was in Lost Horizon. Exactly. See? Look closely. Take your time. The same guy, the same moustache, right? Separated at birth. Now, go back to the last picture before this, if you wouldn't mind, Matt. Yeah, hang on. This picture here, the one with the girl, where he looks like he wants to jump on it very sensibly. Anyone recognize the girl? Any Star Trek fans here?
Oh, Jane Wyman.
Jean Hyatt.
Jane Hyatt.
Jane Hyatt,
Jane
yes.
Wyatt. Jane Wyatt.
Spock's mum, Amanda.
Yeah. Father
Spock's
knows
mum.
best. She was
But then here is where we start.
Father knows best.
Here is where we start our road into the occult. Because Jane Hyatt is not into the occult. She's a working actress. But she plays Spock's mum. She becomes an icon of Star Trek. And who creates Star Trek?
Roddenberry.
Yes, exactly. Gene Roddenberry. And what did Gene Roddenberry do before he was in Star Trek?
Wow.
He was the confidential secretary and right-hand man of the CIA occultist Alwa Pahachi. You might want to look that up properly. I always get the name wrong. He was Hungarian originally, and Hungarians are brilliant, but their names are always a horror to pronounce.
Oh, is it Puharich?
Puharich, yes, it is Puharich. It is our old friend Puharich.
He was the assistant of Puharich?
Yes.
No.
And that's where he got the idea for the Federation.
The
9 ancient Egyptian gods who spoke in the Faraday cage created by the CIA for Puharich were the ones who told Puharich and Roddenberry that the Federation existed.
Right. They were he was going to the 9, the channelers, to try to get transmissions for what became later on the stories of Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. Right.
Exactly.
Huh.
And although I don't believe there's any evidence that Jane Hyatt was into any of this stuff herself, the very fact that she had been in Lost Horizon is a cultural DNA code factor to connect Shangri-La with the vision of Shangri-La, the Buddhist vision of world peace.
Yeah.
Right?
I'll just add to, it seems like I think that Frank Capra was also toying with Theosophy as well as Henry Wallace.
I did not know that, but that is fascinating. And this is consistent, absolutely, because George Bernard Shaw is a passionate supporter of the League of Nations. So is Gandhi. So of all people, although he becomes disillusioned by it, it's Ho Chi Minh, who at first hopes the League of Nations will free the Vietnamese people from their merciless enslavement and bondage at the hands of the French Empire. Of course, they don't. So Ho and Vo and Nguyen Giap turn to more direct means, which are the only ones available to them, to overthrow the crushing tyranny and nightmare. But also we have another old friend of yours and mine, Matt, Jan Christian Smuts, devout Prime Minister of South Africa, who links explicitly the League of Nations to the vision of Isaiah of world peace. A nation shall not rise up against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. This, Jan Christian Smuts says, is the vision of the League of Nations, 2,600 years before the actual perfect league is created in Geneva. You see how powerful this idea is? The leading figure in pushing the League of Nations in Britain is Lord Robert Cecil, who was the grandson of Prime Minister Lord Salisbury. He is a direct descendant of Queen Elizabeth I's Chancellor Cecil, who himself was likely the Queen Elizabeth I's illegitimate son by Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. I can provide bibliography for anyone who wants on this too. Look up the works of Roberta Ballantyne, Balintine. They're heavy going, but they're worth going through, and her ideas sound fantastic, except if you actually know a lot about Elizabethan public domain political history, which I do, which I was forced to actually in my year studying modern history at Oxford. 16th century English history in my day in Oxford was by definition modern history. Modern history stopped at 1939 because the Oxford professors didn't want to bother learning about World War II. But they were totally open to the most excruciating detail of Elizabeth I and Renaissance magic. And I must admit, having a grounding in some of those topics has turned out to be surprisingly relevant in later years. Surprisingly relevant. But what you see is in the 1920s and 1930s, there is a passionate belief system backed eagerly by the Theosophists and by a generation of British imperialists gone soft in the head after World War I, many of whom had lost their own sons in World War I, or who felt blood guilt because they recognized how many people had died in World War I. So the British public and their leadership alike are ripe for the plucking, so to speak. And what is the belief system about the League of Nations? It has made war obsolete, because what will happen if a nation starts a new war? Why? The League will stop it. What could go wrong? In 1928, two of the most eminent statesmen in the world are awarded the Nobel Peace Prize together. The Foreign Minister of France, Auguste Briand, and Frank Kellogg, Secretary of State of the United States in the Coolidge administration. They have signed a pact together, which the leaders of virtually every other nation in the world, including Germany and Japan, sign. What does the pact say? It outlaws war. War has now been outlawed from the human race by a treaty in 1928. What could go wrong? Except 3 years later, in 1931, the entire belief system of the League comes crashing to the ground. It is not the City of London bankers who destroy the League. It is not the evil British imperialists who destroy the League. In fact, British imperialists like our old friend Lord Lothian, Philip Kerr, are passionate supporters of the League. To them, the League is, you can have your cake and eat it. We will keep the British Empire enslaving the world, but nobody will attack the British Empire. There will be no more great wars like with Germany anymore, because through the manipulating the League, nobody will dare go to war anymore. These are people who square the circle. And incidentally, you must remember that's a very basic contradiction at the heart of Buddhist philosophy. In the mandala, you have circles and squares in circles. In a way, it's like a bumbling version towards Leibniz's calculus. It's turning circles into squares and squares into circles by waving the magic wand of the differential calculus. In other words, you can have your cake and eat it. You can have your cake and eat it. There is even a Buddhist dimension to this, a Tibetan dimension. I mentioned Lost Capra's visionary movie, Lost Horizons. Where is Lost Horizons set? It is set in Tibet, in the Tibetan mountains. And it is always the case, as you see to this day, that whenever Tibetan monks and lamas, right up to the Dalai Lama, are presented in Western culture, how are they presented? They are gentle, they are kind, they are all wise, they are humane, they are enlightened, are they not? Are they really? Because the irony is that the Tibetan Lamas made two historical world alliances in the 1920s and 1930s. First, with the Pan-Asian, viciously anti-white, imperialistic and Japanese Bushido racist Black Dragon Society of Tokyo, which was dedicated to the enslavement of the nations of Asia under the Japanese master race. And then in the 1930s, they are visited by German scientific and ethnological groups that are sent by the Ahnenerbe, which is the scholarly scientific research arm of the SS under the personal direction of Heinrich Himmler, dedicated to finding the true racial origins of the Aryan master race. And they established such close relations with the Tibetan Lamas, who loathe Christianity and Christian morality in all its forms, that a large and influential delegation of magic welding Tibetan monks is actually sent to Berlin, where Hitler and Himmler hold them in the highest regard, and where they carry out black magic rituals to support the Third Reich all the way through World War II, until the Red Army gets there in April 1945, and they all commit suicide. And the discovery of all these hundreds of Tibetan monks in Himmler's own quarters, in SS buildings, in Berlin in 1945, puzzles the Russians. After all, they're communists. They're materialists. They don't believe, or at least claim not to believe, in spiritual forces. So it really is a conundrum to them. But they were there all right, and they are documented. And yet, here we have in Shangri-La is based in Tibet. Remember, it's a remote valley that nobody can reach, that it is suicide to even attempt to reach. And the only man who goes there and comes back is Ronald Colman, aka Anthony Eden. And again, there are rich ironies to this. First, Anthony Eden has his own Shangri-La. It exists. It's a shining city on a hill, just like Shangri-La is. It's dedicated to peace and justice and democracy and lovely and spiritual enlightenment, with a large dose of theosophy on the side. And it's by a lake in a valley surrounded by the highest impassable mountains. You have seen it in this presentation. It is the Palace of Nations, the Palais des Nations, in Geneva, Switzerland. It is the League of Nations. And it is Anthony Eden's Shangri-La. And as a junior British minister to the League of Nations from 1931 to 1935, and then as British Foreign Secretary from 1935 to 1938, Eden is regarded as the exact hope. He is the new Woodrow Wilson. He is the new Prince of Peace, the man who will make Wilson's noble dream come true. But what happens to Anthony Eden? Quite a lot, actually. He resigns in principle from Neville Chamberlain's government in 1938 over the issue of appeasement. But he is not opposed to the appeasement of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. He's actually in favor of it. He is opposed to the appeasement of Mussolini in Italy, and his solution is to make an alliance with Nazi Germany against Italy, to stop Italy conquering Abyssinia, modern Ethiopia. In other words, he's another twit. He's a fool. He's an idiot. Winston Churchill, an even bigger drunkard and idiot than Eden, thinks Eden is a towering figure and raises him up as his right-hand man through World War II. From 1942 to 1945, Eden is Foreign Secretary of Britain, and he is responsible for two of the most disastrous and shameful acts in British diplomatic history. First, he does not raise a finger to Stalin's occupation permanently of Eastern Europe, though of course there is little the British can do at that point. There is that. But secondly, at the end of the war, Eden insists upon sending back to the Soviet Union 750,000 Russians, Ukrainians, Tartars, Georgians, virtually everybody from the Soviet Union who will use the Nazi conquest to escape from Stalin into Nazi-occupied Europe. And when the British take over Europe, they do not grant them asylum. The Americans have no part in this. It's all done, although Churchill goes along with it, he's very happy to go along with it, being the drunken, abusive cynic he is, oblivious to all war crimes, but actually 3 ministers carry it out. It is Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, good, virtuous Ronald Colman from Lost Horizons. It is sweet, beloved Harold Macmillan, who becomes Prime Minister of Britain for 6 years himself, nearly 7 years, from the beginning of 1957 to the end of 1963. And it is a fellow called Lord Aldington, who was a senior British minister at the time. And 750,000 people are slaughtered by Stalin and his NKVD, men, women, and children alike. They're sent back in cattle cars at the point of British bayonets, and there are literally thousands of documented cases of people killing themselves and killing their families because they know what will await them otherwise when they go back into Stalin's tender mercies. Now, this is discussed by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago. It is discussed by my old friend Count Nikolai Tolstoy, the great-great-grandson of that Tolstoy, a very fine man, and because of this, the British establishment ruined him and his family through the law courts. They carried out what the Biden people would call lawfare, the manipulation of the courts of law to create injustice rather than justice, which, of course, Biden and his people were brilliant at doing. And so has the British legal system through its history. But the key figure involved in doing this was Anthony Eden. One British leader, particularly not a diplomat, not an intellectual, not a politician, a soldier, opposes this. Field Marshal Sir Harold Alexander, Allied Commander-in-Chief in the Mediterranean of the 15th head of the 15th Army Group, head of all British and American army and British and American armies in Italy at the end of World War II, flatly refuses to deport a single human being. But of course, although he's honourable and never backs down and is courageous, Altrincham and Eden find a way around him. And all those poor people are sent back anyway. This is what Shangri-La meant in practice. It meant sending 750,000, almost all innocent, terrified human beings, men, women, and children, back to be tortured and slaughtered en masse in a genocide by a regime whose genocidal record was all too evident by that point. This is what the dream of Shangri-La leads to in real life. But the League of Nations already had failed in real life. It collapsed in 1931. As I said, it did not collapse because the City of London undermined it. It did not collapse because the Wall Street bankers undermined it. The Jews did not attack it. The Bolsheviks, the communists, did not attack it. Even the Nazis were not ready to take it on at the time. They hadn't taken power in Germany yet. So if it's not the British Empire, and it's not the English ruling classes, and it's not the Wall Street, and it's not the City of London, and it's not the Jews, and it's not the communists, it's not even the Freemasons, who is responsible? Imperial Japan is responsible. Because the Showa Emperor Hirohito and his people are determined to enslave Manchuria for its raw materials and cold resources. And they occupy all of Manchuria in 1931. And the League condemns the move. So what does Japan do? It walks out of the League. And what does the League do? It has condemned Japan. And it doesn't have a clue what else to do. They send a mission of inquiry to see what the condition of the Manchurian people actually is under the Japanese. It's under a British diplomat, Lord Lytton. Now, the British government actually wants to turn the other cheek to this. What they actually want to do is they want to condemn the League. There is an attitude you find towards President Donald Trump today, and you find towards Vietnam and Biafra in the 1960s. The British middle class and ruling class love to condemn the world from a high moral position. They are the shining city on the hill. They are Shangri-La. But when there is a monstrous crime which is carried out by the British Empire, whether it is the sending of 750,000 Russians to their and Cossacks to their and Ukrainians and everybody else to their deaths at the hand of Stalin in 1945, or whether it was the starving to death of 3 million Christian black people of the Igbo tribes of Nigeria in order to safeguard the investment wealth to maintain control of Nigeria's vast oil reserves in the Biafra so-called Civil War of 1967 to 1970, as I can testify being a British university student at that time. All these holier-than-thou moral bags of shit who will condemn America for everything over Vietnam and will condemn President Trump now for being worse than Stalin and Hitler cubed, will not raise a manicured fingernail to even object to these monstrous crimes carried out by their own democratically, supposedly elected government. That's British democracy and British morality for you. That's the reality of British morality for you. And of course, in Canada, especially the native peoples of Canada, as you well know, have known these monstrous double values, as the native peoples of Australia did before them, for hundreds of years. And the British remain oblivious to it to this day. They have just signed a treaty with full public support in Britain with Ukraine, which contains a not-so-secret annex, which the Ukrainians have already leaked, which will give Britain control over the taxes, the raising of taxes, the customs duties, the excises, and the import and export controls of Ukraine for 100 years. This is exactly the same terms that were used to impoverish and enslave China for 100 years, from 1840 to 1943. Exactly the same terms. So neo-colonialism of the 1840s of the East India Company, the enslavement of India and China and of billions of people around the world for 100 years and more thereafter, is not dead. There are efforts to revive it, stronger than ever today. And of course, central to that is the destabilization of China and the wrecking of Russia, which is why they are running and pulling the United States into running the risk of nuclear war with Russia, because the Russians will not back down on this. And nobody in Britain will believe it. Maybe you'll find a few people like us here, unsophisticated people who either broke from the university system or were never subjected to it, or who actually don't watch PBS News or CBC or the BBC or the Times of London, or most of all, the Sainted Guardian of the New York Times. I love your laughter, Jenny. Absolutely, exactly. Perfect telepathic understanding. Exactly. I mean, just in the last week, I have cursed out people who I've known for 50 years because I couldn't take their expletive, deleted hypocrisy and lies in the face of all this monstrous filth anymore. I think, if anything, we are too peaceful. We are too tolerant. We have tolerated too many, all of us as individuals and as groups, we have tolerated too many outrageous lies. And most of all, you all know it, the superior, the condescending smile. I'm too polite to actually tell you you're all ignorant, fanatical cultists and what have you and what have you. You listen to this clown Sieff, you listen to this neo-cultist Ehret, you listen to this warmonger Edward Lazansky and what have you. You know, we're superior to all of you, sniff, sniff. They know SFA. They know SFA. They're full of pig shit. Except the pig is a noble animal. You should not slander it by comparing. I mean, the pigs of Iowa fed the British and American and Soviet armies through World War II. A great and noble sacrifice. None of these people would be worth slaughtering to feed to the people of Russia or Ukraine today. Not one of them. Heaven knows what you contract from them. Certainly some kind of brain disease, because there was madness in the earth through the 1920s and 30s. So the League of Nations bubble bursts in 1931 over Manchuria. Except it doesn't really burst, because you see, it's only Japanese enslaving China. They're yellow people. They don't matter. This is the official view of Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill in the 1920s refuses to fortify the British naval base at Singapore against land attack because he minutes The idea of Japan traveling 4,000 miles to invade Malaya and conquer Singapore is ludicrous. It will not happen in my lifetime. The great prophet Churchill, as usual, has spoken. And in 1940, he refuses to even send biplanes, World War I vintage, to add to air cover over Malaya, because it isn't necessary. Because he knows the Japanese are a ridiculous little people with bad teeth and no dentists and weird glasses that are held together with sellotape, who wore, as they did at Versailles, big formal Western 19th century ridiculous frock coats that look ridiculous on them. And he doesn't realize that they build very good ships and even better aircraft, and that their pilots are the best in the world, much better than those in the Royal Air Force at the time. He's too stupid to realize this, and he never does. Whether it's black people across all of Africa, or the Indian nation, or all the peoples of China and Japan, they're just pickaninny subhumans to Winston Churchill. They are not a white race, or aristocrats among the right race. And this is all documented. And people just laugh it off. It's, again, our old Freud has to kick in again here. People refusing to see what is most obvious in front of their own eyes. So in 1931, although the League has completely collapsed and does not raise a fingernail for the enslaved people of China under the most merciless conditions of Japanese occupation, and Japanese occupation of Manchuria is as monstrous as the Nazi occupation of the Soviet Union was in World War II. They even have a refinement that even the Nazis never managed to come up with. They kill 1 million Chinese by deliberately infecting them with typhus and bubonic plague because they are experimenting with biological warfare. And the impetus for this comes directly from Hirohito, the Showa emperor himself, because he is actually a trained and serious and respected biological scientist, according to the principles of his heroes, who are Napoleon Bonaparte and Charles Darwin. And to the day he dies, 44 years after the end of the war, Hirohito has busts of his two heroes in his imperial study in Tokyo, Charles Darwin and Napoleon Bonaparte. And that is worth thinking about. Now remember, the enslavement of Manchuria takes place in 1931. Hitler does not take power until 1933. Not to worry, the World Disarmament Conference is still in full flow in Geneva at the time, and many British leaders are embracing it. Most of all, the Foreign Secretary of Britain at the time, Arthur Henderson. Now, even in these days of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and The Guardian in London and Keir Starmer, the extraordinary ineptitude, ignorance, self-righteousness, innocence, and mouth-watering stupidity of Arthur Henderson, His Majesty's Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, and then Secretary General of the League of Nations from 1931 to 1935, has to be seen to be believed. The great British historian Corelli Barnett, who is not one of us, he's a British imperialist and proud of it, but he's an open and honest British imperialist. He knows what he stands for and what he doesn't stand for, and he recognizes that the League is a catastrophe. And the central issue of the League is the League convinces the democratic nations, or theoretically democratic nations, from the United States through the British Empire and France to unilaterally disarm. But then they must keep the peace in the whole world. But what do they do if other nations like Japan and later Italy and most of all Germany start arming when everybody else still believes in the League of Nations and refuses to arm? What can you do when your enemy has the Luftwaffe or the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Force and you don't? What do you do then? Here again, Lord Corelli Barnett. The Collapse of British Power. This is a book that was written 50 years ago, 1972, it was published, more than 50, half a century. And it is more true now than it was then. It's a huge book, almost 600 pages of text, and each page is twice the size of an ordinary paperback. So it's equivalent of 1,200 modern pages, really. And if you read it today, and I recommend it to all of you, as I've said before, cross out the word Britain wherever you see it and replace it with America. Cross out the word Germany wherever you see it and replace it with Russia. Cross out the word Japan wherever you see it and replace it with China. And you can also cross out the words League of Nations and replace it not with the United Nations, but with NATO. With NATO. Because what do we have today? We have a new league of more than 30 European nations, all white, which are now dedicated to spreading democracy, freedom of speech, by their definition, around the world. And they will not accept any nation that does not do it. And they will destabilize and preferably use economic sanctions to isolate and economically destroy any nation that does not agree with them and does not back down to their resolutions. This is the League of Nations, wasn't it? But it is also post-1989 US and British-led NATO. That is exactly what it is today. Except, of course, NATO has more teeth, supposedly, than the League of Nations. The League of Nations never has the guts, thank God, to actually directly invade anybody. But NATO has done so. They have destroyed and destabilized the nations of Libya and Yemen and Syria and Iraq. And now they drove Ukraine into a war. They encouraged, they toppled the democratic, peaceful government of Ukraine in 2014. They replaced it with a chaos in which CIA-backed neo-Nazi military forces, paramilitary forces, slaughtered scores, not scores, but many thousands of Russian civilians and security personnel in two Russian secessionist provinces of Gdansk and Lugansk over the next 8 years. And then when the Russians moved in to Ukraine to stop this slaughter, the leaders of NATO whipped up their publics who were only too happy to swallow every lie that was given to them, to basically encourage the extremely undemocratic, not at all democratically elected clique in Kiev, which routinely arrests and murders and assassinates all its political critics and opponents and independent journalists. And instead we have been feeding them weapons to slaughter Russians by the scores of thousands ever since. And then we are surprised when the Russians escalate to any degree whatsoever. But the Russians repeatedly sought, and even Zelensky and his people at times fitfully sought, to peacefully end this war, which has cost 1.5 million Ukrainian lives so far. But the new League of Nations in Brussels, not in New York or in Geneva, but in Brussels, which is where NATO is based, refused to let it happen. So there has been a blood sacrifice again. And one might even speculate if demons are being praised and offered in secret rituals in Geneva and Brussels. I don't know that they're not. Do you? We've offered you 1.5 million Ukrainian lives so far to be slaughtered by the Russians. Would you like more dead? There is no end to this. The violence keeps escalating. And if you say this to readers of The Guardian in Britain, the holier-than-thou people who regard President Trump as a joke or a Nazi, and worst of all, you could not bring him to a Hampstead dinner party. You could not present him at a Hampstead dinner party. All you get is the superior condescending smile and sneer. Now, many of you may not have experienced this. I see you have, Jenny, the light of recognition. Isn't it there? Exactly. It takes one to know one. We know this. This is the way these people are. They were like this to me 55 years ago when I was a university student, before I reached my young, vigorous, health, dynamic condition you see me in today. All of the above. And it doesn't change. The new generation does it too, but most of all, the old generation are not like us, because we're here because most of us used to drink the Kool-Aid, but finally recognized the taste and what it was doing to our brains and our bodies too. These people never give up on it. And they never give up offering up sacrifices of limitless numbers of human beings. So, having failed to raise a fingernail to stop the Japanese conquering Manchuria in 1931, is it a wonder that Anthony Eden, aka Ronald Coleman, and his Theosophists fail to prevent even Mussolini, not exactly the most fearsome or formidable of world leaders, from conquering Ethiopia again with poison gas? Actually, Matt, let's run that shot now, because in 1936, H.G. Wells, a great supporter of the League of Nations, of course, makes a remarkable movie, and it's typical with Wells that the movie is visually brilliant and it's amazingly prophetic, but it's also evil. And it's also delusionally stupid, all at the same time, brilliant and stupid at the same time. Here we are, peace from the skies, and Air Force is bringing peace to the world. Roll 'em, cowboy.
From 57:46 is fine. I mean,
yes, I think that should be fine. Till about 60.
Let's go a little bit. We'll do about 3 minutes.
Yes.
What do you know about these world communication people? Have they got gas? What sort of gas? I know nothing about gas. Tell us about these masks, anyway.
Well, they're rotten. They're no good at all.
What sort of gas have they got?
I tell you, gas isn't my business.
Well, they can't gas us when you're here, anyway. Here they are! Listen! They're coming already! Bring them out here, out in the open, tie them up where they can be seen. Where's the other fella? He's the prize hostage. He's the best of the lot. They'll know him. Fetch him. Fetch him. Look. Is that gas? Anyway, you won't get out of this. You?
Don't you see we're beaten?
Shoot them! What are you all doing? Why don't you move?
Okay.
I never did you any harm. I saved your father and I saved you.
Should I stop it?
Yes, is that okay? Now, you see what we've just seen. Here is H.G. Wells' solution to the problem enforcing the League of Nations one world peace. You will have a universal air force that will pour poison gas down on all the nations that refuse to keep the law. What could go wrong? Let that sink in. Now, of course, in H.G. Wells' version, the gas is not going to be lethal. It'll be harmless. It'll just knock everybody out for 24 hours while the country is occupied. That'll teach him. Well, that's what we've got. We have the United States Air Force, backed by the NATO Air Forces. And we use air power to flatten Libya and Serbia and Syria and Iraq and Yemen, and I apologize, and previously Vietnam and Kosovo. Oh, was it Kosovo? But I'm sure, please feel free, anyone, to add other countries I've missed. But there you are. Romulan warbirds. I love it. Yes, exactly. And Peter, bless you, you're right again. I did not mention 1956 Suez, because Anthony Eden, Ronald Colman, the champion of the League of Nations, the man who was responsible for sending all those poor people back, 750,000 people back to be slaughtered by Stalin, wasn't finished there. He carries out his own Mussolini-style invasion of an African nation 20 years later in 1956, except where Mussolini succeeds in the short term in conquering Ethiopia, which was much more difficult. Eden can't even conquer the canal zone of Egypt. He bungles even that, which should have been well within the reach of the much larger and more formidable British and French navies of the time, backed by Israel. So he's a bungler. And to add to all the weird, twisted cultural connections on this, Eden retires, a broken prime minister, though he lives for another 20 years or so. But where does he retire to? He takes a home, a luxury home, of course, outside England, in Jamaica, the island of Jamaica. And it is called Goldeneye. It is the home of Ian Fleming, creator of James Bond 007. So Ronald Colman, the champion of peace, the champion of Shangri-La, the man who was going to be the Prince of Peace in the 1930s, launches a bungled war on the lines of Mussolini in 1955, has used the power of the British Empire to send 750,000 innocent people back to be slaughtered under Stalin in 1945, and finally retires to the home of a rather bad popular pornographer, Ian Fleming, in luxury in Jamaica in 1957. Well, that's the British Empire for you. And I see there are some questions coming in. Hopefully there's time to give them justice. Thank you for your patience. As always, it's a privilege and a pleasure.
The pleasure is all ours, Marty. These are always the funnest classes. Yeah, there's so many thoughts. I mean, one thing that caught my attention is the irony, whether you're looking at Woodrow Wilson and the globalists of a century ago, these liberal globalists who have these high utopian ideals, but yet they don't have a problem supporting hardcore KKK revivalists like Woodrow Wilson was doing in America, sponsoring eugenics, or in today's world, sponsoring ardent neo-Nazis and Hitler-loving revivalists in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. It's like they don't seem to either have a problem with the paradox or they're just dishonest, and it's probably a bit of both. But yeah, that struck me throughout the whole thing. And again, I really appreciated your dovetailing on the occult underpinnings of things. I took so many notes. That's so important. I didn't know about the Black Dragon Gang. Honestly, it was something I'd only seen laterally, let alone their connection to a Tibetan high priesthood that had networks and hundreds of monks in Himmler's like Annenelbe facilities. That's scary, interesting. Definitely. What do you think they were doing there? Like, what sort of ritual magic or whatever do you think they were trying to like do in Himmler's estates or the Wewelsburg?
For rather obvious reasons, I have not gone into and do not want to go into the arcane details of either Tibetan or Black Dragon or most of all SS. magical rituals. But there are many very good books on this. If you look up Nazi and occult, even on Amazon.com, there are lots of very good sources. But there is one. These tend to dwell on the Western aspects. They ignore the Tibetan aspect and they ignore the Japanese aspect. There is one amazing and outstanding book on this. It's one of the greatest works of original historical research ever written. I cannot recommend it highly enough to everyone. It is enormous. It is 1,200 pages long, and they are small print pages. They've got 2,400 pages in a regular paperback. And it has 200 pages of notations, of footnotes to it in the original Japanese. It is by a veteran Time Life magazine writer called David Bergamini, Bergamini, Bergamini. The book is called Japan's Imperial Conspiracy. Bergamini was quite literally crucified when the book came out. It broke his health. He died at the age of only 56, living in Tokyo at the time. I have the gut instinct and suspect that the Japanese probably poisoned him, which in the land of sushi is not really hard to do, if you're serious about it. There's strong evidence that the great Iris Chang, who documented the first great genocidal war crime, the rape of Nanjing, in which 750,000 people were killed and hundreds of thousands of women raped and bayoneted, not because the Japanese people were savages, they were not, but as a direct result of orders from imperial headquarters, which fascinatingly enough, the emperor himself and the royal family, who were in overall charge, were sent the orders from imperial headquarters for the war in China in the city of Hiroshima at the time in 1937. What goes around comes around. What goes around comes around. But Bergamini's book is quite extraordinary. And it is really a total reevaluation of Japanese history from the Meiji Restoration in 1859. All was 1868. I think it was 59, but I stand to be corrected. There's a miserably bad movie made by that idiot who's an occult himself, Tom Cruise, called, I think, The Last Samurai or something or other. And it's a terrible movie. But it has a very bowdlerized description. The point is, the imperial restoration was a real restoration. After 250 years behind the bamboo curtain as purely ceremonial high priests, the hereditary god emperors of Japan became emperors in deed and act as well as name under the Meiji emperor, and this was very clear. Now, the Meiji emperor had two apparently conflicting policies at the same time. He dramatically raised the standard of living of his people, and he played a central role, as Bismarck did, and Alexander II did, and Abraham Lincoln did, in preventing his nation from being swallowed alive and raped alive by the British Empire and the Western powers. And this was admirable and total. But there was a dark side to him, too, that led directly to the enslavement of Korea, the aggression against China and the seizing of Taiwan in 1895, and eventually to the Russia-Japanese War. And the British Empire and Theodore Roosevelt both supported the Meiji Emperor in Japan totally because they wanted to destroy the Russian Empire and enslave it from the West. And the alliance from Japan was seen as part of this. But there is a very real, admirable, democratic, constitutional, enlightened, in the best sense, tradition in Japan. And what you find in the 1930s, from 1930 to 1936, is that the leaders of this, bankers, financiers, industrialists, prime ministers, are systematically assassinated by both groups in the army who trace their loyalty directly back to the imperial court of the emperor, of the Showa emperor himself in Tokyo. And what you actually find in the planning for World War II is, while the army is genocidally ruthless in China, the army is opposed to attacking the United States and the British Empire. They have their hands full with China. It is the Navy, led by Combined Fleet Commander, the brilliant but erratic Isoroku Yamamoto, who plans the Pearl Harbor attack. They are the hawks who want to take on the British Empire and America at the same time. Now, as Netanyahu is now learning in Israel, he can't even conquer or pacify Gaza, and he takes on Iran at the same time.
Yeah.
And Iran is part of the Shanghai Security Cooperation Organization, the SCO, with Russia and China and India and Pakistan as its strategic allies. And Netanyahu is ready to take on all of them because he believes that he has two strategic allies, much bigger, on his side. Who are these allies? They are the United States of America. To me, perhaps not America, but Donald Trump. And the other ally? Why, it's Almighty God, of course. Now, remind me, Jenny, I'll send to you and anybody else who wants to ask me to. There was an article in the excellent Hebrew and English language Tel Aviv newspaper Haaretz just last week, in which it documents how the teaching that Benjamin Netanyahu is the literal first Messiah of Jewish tradition is now believed by 1 million ultra-Orthodox lunatics in Israel, all of them. And it's being openly taught by them. They're not even just teaching it in secret with a wink and a nod. They're open about it. Exactly, Jenny. Now, you see, once you reach this level of insanity and delusion, anything is possible. Any self-destruction is possible. These people are a menace, obviously, to the peoples of Gaza and even Iran. But they're a menace to the whole world. But most of all, they're a menace to all Israelis, sane and insane alike. Most Israelis are not that insane, but in their government system, they're not rising up against them. And it's time they did. Because they're going to go down in flames with the rest of them. But again, this is the underlying theme of what we're talking about here. Mass delusion and stupidity.
Yeah.
In the 1920s and 30s, after the horrors of World War I, again, there's many of the themes we've discussed here and I brought up come back here. How there are conspiracies, how they do succeed in assassinating peace-loving leaders, how they do succeed in launching monstrous wars. But then the wars never go the way that the conspiracies plan them to or think they can. They're not in control of the world. They're able to derail the world and wreck the world. But they're not the gods they imagine themselves to be. They don't control the world. And so the situation spirals out of their control very quickly too. We saw this in World War I. So after World War I, we see some of the most devoted British imperialists who are schizophrenic exactly the way you said, Matt. Lord Lothian, Philip Kerr is an excellent example of this. And you made the point, do they believe it? Do they disbelieve it? I believe it's the schizophrenia is, I've thought a lot about this over many years. The schizophrenia is central to them. They have to believe they're morally superior to everyone else. And part of this is inflicting genocide on other people. And far from being worried about it, they sleep well at nights. They think, since they are the God people, none of the blood will come back on their hands. Remember Lady in the Scottish play? The wife of the murderer? A little water cleanses us of this blood. Always come back to Shakespeare Marlowe, right? Who is who he really was, right? Bard of Avon, indeed. He was the Bard of Canterbury and Cambridge. A little water cleanses us of this blood. They should be proud. Those 1.5 million Ukrainian boys should be proud to be slaughtered for the cause of world peace. Because they're making the League of Nations, which is now called NATO, all-powerful. What could go wrong?
Peter Nikitas, I know you had a few thoughts there. If you want to pick one or two questions, you could toss them out.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Martin. I did run a few questions off kind of spur of the moment. I'm going to concentrate on one area where you touched on with Anthony Eden and Suez in 56, Martin. They're kind of related. Did Wilson ever meet Ben-Gurion or Jabotinsky at Versailles? And related to that, how much influence did Louis Brandeis have over Wilson concerning Palestine? And how does that affect us today?
Oh, superb questions with surprising answers. No, Wilson never met Ben-Gurion. He probably didn't meet Chaim Weizmann. Winston Churchill and Lord Balfour knew Weizmann very well and thought the world of him. But as I've given in different lectures here before, and I really didn't clarify my own thinking on this because it's very complicated. And no either pro-Zionist or Zionist-hating historians alike. To use Matt's term and Cynthia's, when you polarize, you become blind. Usually the truth is a different way entirely from the two false extremes and the two false dichotomies. So to reject von Hayek doesn't mean you swallow Keynes. To swallow Keynes doesn't mean you reject Hayek or what have you. You reject both of them, or you navigate between them. Same here. There are three Zionisms. There is the Zionism of Chaim Weizmann, which was always a manipulated tool of the British Empire, which Weizmann was too vain and stupid to see, but which he was all his life. There was the genuine constructive Zionism, I would maintain, which sought peaceful development all along and did go to highly successful militarization and violence at the end, but really only very reluctantly at the end of the day, for which they were criticized very much by the right-wingers. And this constructive Zionism was the labor Zionism of David Ben-Gurion from 1919 to 1948. And there is a third Zionism, which is Netanyahu Zionism, which is the Jabotinsky Zionism. Now, as you said, Peter, Ben-Gurion and Jabotinsky were both in Paris. Neither of them met Churchill. Neither of them met Woodrow Wilson. Churchill would have been aware of Jabotinsky, because Jabotinsky was a useful tool for the British at first, but by 1920 he's already such a blowhard, out of control, incompetent little fool that the British ban him from Palestine and he never returns as early as 1920. Jabotinsky is a big-mouthed, loud-talking incompetent. He's very much another Mazzini. He's a useful idiot for the forces of imperialism. But he's an idiot. But he is certainly the ideological forebear of the Likud and the religious nationalists to this day, though he's very much a secularist. The spiritual leader of, right-wing Zionism is now looked upon as Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook, who starts the settlements and who blesses the settlements in the West Bank back in the 1970s. And he is the son of the chief rabbi of Israel from 1919 to 1935, the so-called saintly Abraham Isaac Kook. Now, Abraham Isaac Kook is an idiot. You should look him up. I mean, see if you can make sense of any of his writings. He's such a clown, it's very entertaining. He's brought by sympathetic senators, including William Borah, to meet President Calvin Coolidge in the 1920s. And Cook, who doesn't speak a word of English and never learns it, has composed a gigantic, I think about 96-verse poem in Hebrew, praising President Coolidge as a new Moses, as a new Joshua, as a new Daniel, every hoary old ancient cliche from, ancient rabbinic rotting texts thousands of years old, and he'll dredge it up, and it doesn't even rhyme properly or scan. But he's such a self-righteous idiot, he insists on reading the whole poem, and it takes an hour and a half to President Coolidge, who doesn't understand a word that is being said, right? And this is Cook, who regular Orthodox rabbis of the day, who are much more sensible and grounded and sane, despised Cook as an idiot. And so did Ben-Gurion, and so even did Jabotinsky. Even Jabotinsky. But today, of course, Netanyahu is very happily in the hands of these lunatics and believes them himself. But no, Ben-Gurion is at Versailles. Even Jabotinsky is blundering around at Versailles. Ben-Gurion never meets any of the movers and shakers of the day, but he becomes a close, personal, lifelong friend of one man, another man who will also become a huge figure of a small nation in world history. He is so poor that he cannot afford his own lodgings. So he shares his lodgings in a rotting Paris tenement building with a young, idealistic Asian visitor. His name is Ho Chi Minh. Yeah. And they become lifelong friends. And Ho Chi Minh loves Ben-Gurion so much that he assures Ben-Gurion, when the British break their vows and promises to build a Jewish national home in Palestine and start turning Jewish refugees from anti-Semitism away in their millions Do not worry, I will make sure there is a refuge for you in Vietnam. And he meant it. And he meant it. Remember, this is the same Ho Chi Minh who celebrates freedom from the French in 1945, in which he is supported by President Franklin Roosevelt. What does Ho Chi Minh do? To a crowd of 1 million people in Hanoi, he reads the US Declaration of Independence. He does not read the words of Karl Marx, he reads the words of Thomas Jefferson. But Harry Truman listens to Winston Churchill and backs the French, because we've got to stop the communists at all costs. And obviously Ho is going to be an evil communist, so we've got to keep the French in Vietnam. So at least 7 million innocent Vietnamese die in the next 30 years of war. And 80,000 Frenchmen, the cream of French boys, more French boys die fighting the Viet Minh and in Algeria than died fighting, and they fought bravely, against the Nazi Wehrmacht in 1940. In 2 totally unnecessary, unforgivable colonial wars, pour la gloire de France, for the glory of France, except it wasn't. And who's the man who ends all this needless suffering from the French perspective? Charles de Gaulle. For which, of course, the CIA and the French true fascists never give President de Gaulle and endlessly conspire to try and murder him. But no, they never met in Weizmann. Churchill thought Weizmann was a genius, but then he thought Venizelos was a genius. If you're an asshole, Churchill will think you're a genius. He thought Mussolini was a genius. He was open about it at the time. He thought President Roosevelt had a weak mind for strategy and had to be set right by Churchill through the war. In fact, it was Churchill who fought D-Day, tried to prevent it to the last minute, didn't want Europe to be invaded until at least 1946, by which time all the Jews and resistance fighters in Europe would have been dead. And it's President Roosevelt who has to make common cause with Stalin to make sure D-Day is launched in 1944. The idea that President Roosevelt is a moral illiterate, again, is another big, fat, bold, obscene British lie. It's a Churchill lie. Churchill didn't have to learn from Goebbels. He taught Goebbels. The bigger and more outrageous the lie, the more people will believe you, at least if it's Winston Churchill saying it with thoughtful, stern, tempered 18th century, moral, dignified prose. It's empty. It's bullshit. It's worthless. But hopefully that answers your question, Peter. If there's any follow-up, far away.
Brandeis on Wilson.
Oh, yes, thank you. There again, much misunderstood. Not remotely as significant as he's made out to be. Anti-Semites and the Zionists love the idea. Brandeis never had any impact on the political leadership of Israel whatsoever. He never wanted Israel to be an independent state. He believed in simply the British theme of a Jewish national home under the British. He hated the idea of a Jewish army. He hated the idea of Jewish self-defense. He loved the idea of a Jewish-Arab joint state, which again is another noble liberal theory, but that was never going to happen even if there hadn't been a history of war and outrage and dislocation and dispossession and terrorism on both sides from the 1920s onwards. It was never going to happen because you had 2 societies that were just so different from each other in the first place. The best you could hope for from the beginning was indeed some kind of peaceful partition. But of course, for a whole variety of reasons on both sides and other sides as well, that was never practical or effectively came about. The militant Palestinian leadership and eventually the mainstream Jewish democratic leadership in Israel under Ben-Gurion recognized this. Brandeis never did. He opposed it every step of the way. He was politically non-existent as far as the political history of Israel and the Jewish community in Israel went. And so was Einstein. Totally. And for that matter, so was Chaim Weizmann.
Petey Lawton. Are you still there, Petey?
I'm here, Matt. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hi. Yeah. Hi, that's brilliant. Thank you so much, Marty. You always set my mind on fire. And
I love you too, ma'am.
I thoroughly enjoyed your last presentation that you did for Matt and Cynthia. So I've got 3 things. number one is I missed what you were saying about smuts.
Right. Hold on.
Okay.
I have to keep talking. I can hear you, but I need to get a pen to make sure I don't miss your points.
Okay, J.C. Smuts. Is he the
Yeah.
one you said was related to the Cecils? I missed what you said there. That's my first question. Then my second question is, I love your going back to Jesus not having been this man of peace, but this idea that we've been given that we must not wage war. And then coming back to League of Nations, I love that idea, and I want to put it to you that going to Africa and the last 60 years, we have seen this absolutely provable hindering of peace and stability, and that you can actually identify that body that has put a stop to anyone wanting to stop war as the United Nations Peacekeeping Department. So that department is very, very interesting. And if I might just bring in one, and perhaps that is also your NATO, because that Security Council, that's heavily NATO biased. So if we just take one example of the UN Peacekeeping Department's role in perpetuating war and instability, we could go to something topical at the moment, and that's Rwanda DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. And in 1994, a private military company put forward a proposal to stop the insurgency, the RPF insurgency coming from Uganda, which would have stopped the genocide. They put in a proposal, highly workable, history, 100% success rate of everything they did, this PMC. And the UN said, oh, no, that's way too expensive, turned them down, and it has since cost umpteen billions. So, and then that it's a great book. Perhaps can interest you in reading it. It's called War for Africa, and it's by Ibn Barlow. So here's the founder of the PMC, and he's had the most incredible amount of media slandering, and the whole idea of they've tried to equate everything that his PMC, his private military company, has done as being apartheid South Africa. They've tried to smear him with that whole white South African label. And his career from 1993 onwards involved in Angola, Sierra Leone, Lord's Resistance Army, every insurgency that there has been on the continent. It mirrors the history of the entire continent in terms of perpetuating instability. So that UN Peacekeeping Department is very much in that role that you're talking of, the perpetuation of war. So I just wanted to bring that in, and to ask you if you do agree upon that idea. My last thing for you, Marty, please, is in future, when you talk about the millions dead by this entity, please can you include the 10 million plus, probably more like 12, 13, 14 in Central Africa?
Yes.
Yeah, because we always bypass that one. And just to quickly say that, sorry, it was something you said sparked it. Now I've forgotten. But Bechtel, Elon Musk, Robert Friedland, that whole international, we call them the international mineral mafia.
Yes.
Elon Musk just got, Starlink just got the the rights to do DRC. Now, they are the same people who supplied the satellite images of 800,000 Rwandan refugees in DRC who were subsequently slaughtered. They gave the slaughterers, who were the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the mapping, the satellite mapping, so that they would know where to find them and kill them. So that whole imperialist thing is there as well. It so fits in with what you're saying. So I'll just shut up now, and thank you once again for such an illuminating talk.
I have little to add to what you said for two reasons, though of course I'll be adding more anyway. But the first is I agree completely and completely endorse everything you said, and thank you for bringing up all these extra points. They're enormous. Secondly, because as you yourself have pointed out, there is room here for and a whole series of seminars, not just from me, but from other people on this and on related topics. It's a huge subject. And one subject I've even toyed with, and Matt and I have just been more casually bouncing it back and forth, but it is this. And that is in the decolonization of Africa takes place under the Macmillan government in Britain from 1961 to 63. Democratic regimes are set up, at least theoretically, all across most of Africa, because the British had controlled all the wealthiest parts of Africa. They controlled a huge swathe of half of Africa, from Egypt all the way down to the Cape, Rhodes's dream come true. And they also, of course, had Nigeria with its vast areas and population and oil wealth. They had all of this. But from 1961 to 63, the British at least give up direct political control to democratic regimes. And President John Kennedy supports this, and he's in the White House at the time. But in 1963, two things happen. First of all, the supposedly conservative, but actually liberal Prime Minister of Britain at the time, Macmillan, and ironically, it's the same Macmillan who sent all these 750,000 people black to be murdered by Stahl in 1945. But in Africa, his record is enlightened. He's actually trying to remove the British Empire direct control as more trouble than it's worth. And he's reassuring the British city of London, you'll still have all your financial interests. We've taken care of all of that. But they have actually set up, under Ian MacLeod as colonial secretary, genuine democratic regimes that appear to be stable all the way across the former British colonies of Africa. And President Kennedy, who is a very close friend of Macmillan's personally, supports Macmillan to the hilt on this. But then two strange things happen in 1963. Macmillan is forced out of office by a weird sex scandal in which the British Secret Services seem to be working to deliberately bring down his own conservative government. Why? And the following year, in 1964, a Labour Party government under Harold Wilson is accused of being pro-Soviet, though he isn't really. He keeps the British nuclear deterrent. He's a loyal ally of the United States. Through thick and thin, he's dependent on America to support his bungled economic policies at home. But under Wilson, under the Labour government, dark things happen in Africa. And President Kennedy has been assassinated in 1963. And even before President Kennedy has been assassinated, as Matt and Cynthia have documented very carefully and precisely, Patrice Lumumba has been murdered by the US deep state in Congo, which later becomes Zaire, and is looted dry and its people impoverished, even before the latest cycle of genocide under Mobutu, with the backing of the big American corporations. And this happens starting under Lyndon Johnson, with the enthusiastic continuation under Presidents Richard Nixon, George Herbert Walker Bush, Ronald Reagan, the whole lot of them afterwards. What I would suggest here very strongly is that as long as President Kennedy was alive and in power, and as long as Prime Minister Macmillan was in power, the move of Africa to create democratic, stable regimes in Africa for the betterment of the African peoples was real. But the American and British deep states in the City of London lost no time with the aid of the British deep state in eliminating Prime Minister Macmillan. And then, under the so-called progressive Labour government, classic British hypocrisy under Harold Wilson, they starved 3 million people to death in Nigeria alone. And there are 2 books you should read on this, both by the same man. One is factual, one is a novel. They're both by the writer who's just died in his late 80s, one of the most popular thriller writers of modern times, Frederick Forsyth. And he's very much a British patriot. But in his day, he's very close, and in fact is clearly involved with the British deep state. And the knowledge that he gets from this informs his books. The Day of the Jackal, very famous novel, very famous movie, is very clearly a sanitized version of the plot to kill de Gaulle, while trying to get the British government off the hook. In fact, what happens is the British deep state and the CIA are trying to kill de Gaulle continually. But Harold Macmillan gets word of this and has been a friend of de Gaulle's and a colleague of his since World War II. And Macmillan, we know, actually goes to the trouble of sending messages to the head of the British Secret Service and the head of the British Foreign Office, which are unprecedented in British history, saying that any investigation by the French authorities to protect President de Gaulle must be cooperated with to the full power of the British government. The Prime Minister, who is being forced out himself at the time, feels the need to try and enforce cooperation with the government of President de Gaulle because he knows his own deep state is out to murder President de Gaulle, and he regards it as dishonorable. But in order for the British, for democratic governments to be destroyed through Africa, 2 Western leaders who have protected them and supported them must be removed. First, Prime Minister Macmillan, who set up democratic systems in the first place from 1961 to 1963. And by the end of 1963, he is gone in a very sleazy sex scandal in which he is not personally involved, but which his government is smeared with, and he is forced out of office. He is also given misleading information about his own health, that he is a dying man and must resign the premiership. And it turns out he's not a dying man at all. He has been lied to. He lives for another 23 years, well into his 90s. But the Prime Minister of Britain is lied to in order to get him out of office, out of the way. And of course, on November the 22nd, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, blam, blam, blam. And the President Kennedy is executed in broad daylight. His head is blown apart. And as a result, what do we then see? In 1965, within 18 months, because it takes a few months to get the mechanisms up, the military in all these countries, or presidents who have been gotten to by the British deep state interlocutors, impose one-party rule, or in the case of Nigeria, direct military dictatorship, to safeguard the oil and resources for Rio Tinto Zinc, for British Petroleum, for all the usual suspects. 6 former British colonies that have been set up as constitutional democracies are toppled in quick succession in 1965, and the British public is told, and I was told this at the time as a boy, I read the newspapers at the time, I read the Daily Mirror and the Daily Mail. Oh, that's because they're all just blacks. They're just Africans. They're coons, they're savages. Democracy is wasted on them. No, democracy wasn't wasted on them. It was the white English imperialists who destroyed democracy in order to keep enslaving them. That's what really happened there. So what you are raising here is an enormous and crucially important issue. And of course, the Congo has been the scene of not one, but at least 3 massive cycles of genocide and rape and repression. First, as I discussed in my previous class here on Sir Roger Casement, 10 million people are murdered from 1880 to 1908 by the City of London and its mercenary troops, and private corporations operating along with the greed of the King of Belgium at the time, and to the enrichment of the Belgian ruling class as well. And it's the great Irish humanitarian statesman Roger Casement who exposes this genocide on the world scene and forces an end to it. But the genocide is larger than the Nazi murder of the Jews in terms of the numbers of people who are killed. 10 million people. Secondly, we have the re-enslavement of the peoples of Congo / Zaire by the forces of Western greed and imperialism again, with the backing of the CIA, Lyndon Johnson, Alan Dulles, Richard Nixon, round up the usual suspects all the way into the 20th century. And now, as you have rightly pointed out, we have the third cycle by the militarized killers out of Rwanda, killing another 10 million people. So bless you. Thank you for bringing it up. It is so vital. It is so enormous. It is so shameful. It is always swept under the carpet. And the more we come back to it, the better it would be. Secondly, on the issue of Jesus, Jesus is a hard-headed delight. And I've just published an article citing him at length as a great military strategist to this day in the Middle East. Because, and you can find it on the Pluralia magazine website. Pluralia can be, for some weird reason, difficult to reach in a search engine, but it's worth doing so. Put in Pluralia and multipolar world at the same time, and the relevant section should come up. But what I cite here is I'm talking about the insanity of the Israelis taking on Iran. When the Jewish population of Palestine in the 1st century AD rose against the Roman Empire twice, first to defend their temple, which of course was then burned to the ground, and then to rebuild it under Bar Kokhba, another revolt 60 years later. The result was a fiasco, because you're asking a few score thousand people in an obscure corner of an empire of 70 million people that rules all of known Europe, all of known North Africa, and most of the known Middle East at the time. Rules 3 continents with broad popular support in all of them, and you're expecting to beat them? Well, you're mad, and you're idiots. But Netanyahu and his merry men are even worse, because they have 7 million Jewish Israelis in Palestine, in the land of Israel, whatever you call it, and in Iran alone, apart from the Palestinians, apart from Gaza, apart from Hezbollah, apart from the Islamists in Syria, apart from 80 million people or so, or 90 million people now in Egypt, you have 92 million people in Iran alone, in an area larger than Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and Britain combined. And sure, you can hit them and decapitate their leadership once in a while, and you can maintain a balance of terror with them, and that's actually sensible to do for your own survival. But the idea that you're going to wage full unrestrained war on them and force them to obey you is delusional. It's suicidal. It's stupid. It's insane. It's insane. And Jesus anticipates this. In the Gospels, again, Jesus has his, as I said, his hard-headed Roman side from hanging out with all these centurions. And what does he say about strategy? It still rings true today. He says, if a king is going to war against an army of 20,000 people, and he has only 10,000 soldiers, he can still do it. But he has to count the costs in advance. Can he win? Now, Jesus doesn't go into the details, but it's very clear what he's talking about. Does the king have a strategy? Are his troops well armed? Will they be fighting on the defensive? Can he hold out? Can he simply deter the other guy and get him to tire of the whole thing? In other words, it's not impossible to beat 20,000 men with 10,000 men, but you have to have a plan. You have to have competence. You have to have adaptability. You have to know how to do it. But even Jesus in the Gospels nowhere recommends going against 92 million with only 7 million. When it comes to dealing in the affairs of this world, Jesus is a realist. He's brilliant, not just in things of the spirit, but in things of practicality too. As long as you don't believe that well-meaning sweet little idiot, ignorant idiot Douglas Adams, and as long as you actually bother to go to the Gospels and read what Jesus actually said. Now, as to Jan Christian Smuts, again, so much we can say, and we're in full agreement on this. Smuts is another classic example of what Matt was pointing out before, like William Ewart Gladstone, the moralizing, moralistic, holier-than-thou idiot in politics. He's a dashing young soldier. He's defending an apartheid state that treats black human beings worse than dirt. The British, of course, when he surrenders to them, love him and make him Prime Minister of South Africa. He knows how to speak liberal, uplifting thoughts of high-mindedness to all the white races of the world while keeping the blacks in their proper place. It's more schizophrenic hypocrisy. And there is no contradiction for these people. As I've said before, the founder of modern liberalism in America, as well as in Britain, where he lived, was William Ewart Gladstone, the founder of the English Liberal Party in the 1860s. And Gladstone was a billionaire in 21st century and 20th century standards. And where did his money come from? He didn't earn a penny of it himself. He inherited all from his father, who was the largest slave trader in the world at the time and supplied more black slaves from Africa to the plantations of the American Confederacy than any other human being. Gladstone champions the common man, the worker, and the fools are stupid enough in England to believe him and keep voting for him for more than 40 years as either their finance minister or the prime minister. And at the same time, he champions the Confederacy and the splitting apart of America. In 1862, Gladstone gives a speech in Newcastle on Tyne at the height of Robert E. Lee's victories, in which he says, the Confederacy has proven they are independent. They have proven they can create an army. They have proven they can win battlefield victories. I believe they can prove they are a nation. The enslavement of millions of innocent enslaved black people is not a moral issue for Gladstone, the arch moralizer in English history, and incidentally a passionate and Jew-hating anti-Semite at the same time. Matt's point is central. The apparent contradiction for Woodrow Wilson and Anthony Eden and Gladstone and all these and the Labour government in Britain of the 1960s is central to their, in electricity. I always come back to alternating current. You have two poles, positive and negative, and the fields of current become strengthened when you flip the polarities. And north becomes south, and south becomes north, and positive becomes negative, and negative becomes positive. It's a very empowering, energizing force. It's how we can transmit electricity for long distances. Direct current does not do it. Direct current loses power very quickly. But when you keep flipping the current at transformers, you maintain the strength of the current and you can propagate it virtually forever. And this is the same paradox we see in the moral dystopic universe of liberal white racist hypocrisy. It is not that they are moralistic and holier than thou on idiotic, repulsive, stupid grounds on the one hand, while they enslave billions of people across Asia and across Africa and across South America and drive them to early graves on the other hand. The two hypocrisies feed each other. They are flip sides of the same coin. In Victorian England, the endless, the banning of divorce, the insistence that all children be born inside wedlock, the insistence on respectability, the insistence on Jane Austen purity of language and speech and romantic perfection in everything you do is not a contradiction of slavery. It is not a contradiction of child labor. It is not a contradiction of sending 6-year-old children to work themselves to deaths in coal mines or to choke to death cleaning chimneys that are 30 or 40 feet high. These are flip sides of the same evil, the same psychosis. And Jan Christian Smuts is the embodiment of this.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question. And I saw within the chat section, Monty, who shared some pretty wild experiences. And I'd like, Monty, for you, if you're still there, to run through what the hell is this emissaries of divine light set up by an MI6 agent in 1945 that was run by Lord Martin Sieff and then his son, the Marquesses of Exeter, who ran this thing, which is based in the United States and British Columbia. Like, what is this? Are you there, Monty?
Well, it's quite a yes, yes. It's quite a wild story, actually. After Vietnam, I was pretty well Tavistocked out through my experiences, so it took me several years to recover. And as it happens, I was recruited into this spiritual religious organization in none other than Spokane, Washington. And the person that recruited me was Lord Burleigh, Michael Cecil, who was the son of Lord Martin Cecil, who inherited in the 1950s, in the 1940s. He was introduced by a man by the name of Conrad O'Brien French, who was a British intelligence MI6 agent in World War II. Presumably, at least according to his writings, he was the inspiration. He knew Ian Fleming was somewhat the inspiration for James Bond. But in any case, he was also British Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And through his educational work and so forth, he ran across an itinerant preacher named Lloyd Arthur Meeker, who went by the pen name Yolanda, who presumably had some of experience where he was inspired over several days and had this vision, and through the 30s and 40s went up and down the coast of California preaching this doctrine, which essentially was somewhat imago viva Dei. In other words, Jesus didn't come here ordained by God to be crucified. He had a higher vision of something else to occur. In any case, Conrad O'Brien French ran across these writings and introduced this itinerant preacher to Martin Cecil, Lord Martin Cecil, whose estate was 100 Mile House, British Columbia. And that became the second headquarters. Well, long story short, Lloyd Meeker died in a plane crash under somewhat suspicious circumstances in 1952. Martin Cecil became the bishop of the church, which was known as Emissaries of Divine Light. It was previously, under Yolanda, it was known as the Universal Institute of Applied Ontology. That was his writing. So sometime, I think in the 80s, Martin's brother died, and he inherited the title of the 8th Marquess of Exeter. And so the person that actually recruited me in Spokane, Washington, is the 7th Marquess of Exeter. Michael Cecil became the 8th Marquess of Exeter. After his death, the movement pretty well fizzled out, other than what its original intent was. It broke up. It's now somewhat of a new age kind of communities worldwide, but really no central organization. But
Monty, if they had any significant, I'm sure they did have a significant role as far as manipulation, control mechanisms of cultural warfare during the Cold War. The fact that it was set up by this I looked at his Wikipedia page, this French guy, the MI6 agent, who is also an RCMP guy, very high level figures, and you bring in the Cecils, high level members of the Cecil clan as well who are engaged. It's definitely very important. So did you pick up on any specifics of usefulness this thing had to shape cultural warfare strategy or what have you over the Cold War?
My frustration with them is I was rather sensitive to this. They said some good things that I aligned with, in particular about the actual mission of Jesus. But they really refused to engage politically. It became somewhat of a self-indulgence, personal improvement. In other words, what they were putting out there was really to resurrect the body of Christ on earth in order to have a mechanism for the changes that were to come. In other words, this idea of actual incarnation of the Holy Spirit.
through a body of people, which was the Christ.
Okay. Yeah, it smells very theosophical, Theosophy, Swedenborgian. But okay, that's cool, man. Thank you for that update. Marty, did you ever hear about this thing, or do you want to comment on this
No,
sort of weird operation at all? Or
not really, because simply I don't know.
okay, yeah.
Uh, as I said before, uh, it sounds to me from what I may be wrong, but I've never come across them. Their footprint appears to be very small. I stand to be corrected on this. I simply do not know. But I've not come across anything, and it registers nothing for me. What I have, however, repeatedly come across, as I said in my delivery, and as you picked up on, Matt, was that there are lots of supposedly soft tracers there. We keep picking up on the same useful suspects with overlaps. There's Puharich, there's the move from the League of Nations and the Parliament of the World to Star Trek and the Federation, and the ancient Egyptian Holy Nine and what have you, on the one hand. And you have all these people who are theosophists in the 19th century embracing the League of Nations in the 20th century. And there are these separate and overlapping strains, and there are different ones of of soft-minded Eastern Romanticism. Gandhi, on the one hand, who is very much in the Theosophist tradition, very strongly. And again, I stress very strongly something virtually ignored and totally unknown in the West before Bergamini wrote his great book, and his book has been systematically ignored and buried ever since. Though I think the main motivation for that has simply been if Bergamini is right, which he is, then 100 years of American and British scholarship on Japan is a worthless joke. And they're all fools, and they need to be put in stocks and be pelted with rotten eggs and tomatoes. And that's the one thing that self-important academics cannot stand, as we all know, being exposed as the assholes they are. And to me, that's the main motivation for burying Per Bergamini. But the Black Dragon Society and the bizarre strong connections it has with Tibet and the malevolent role that Tibetan black mysticism plays in encouraging the two most destructive forces of the 20th century alongside communism. And what are they? They are, of course, Japanese racist imperialism under the Showa emperor, under Hirohito, and the Third Reich under Adolf Hitler. And you find the same bizarre Tibetan, of all things, forces coming out. And in both cases, it's also a war against Christianity, and it's a war against what is called the Judeo-Christian ethic, and against the ethical values, the base ethical values of the humanitarian West and the Renaissance. That is a point, I think, which needs to be made too. It's also a war against Enlightenment, in the best sense of the word. I don't mean the 18th century bowdlerization of the Enlightenment, which leads to the terrible revolutions in France and war across Europe. I mean the great 14th and 15th and 16th century Enlightenment that comes out of Florence and northern Italy. It's a war against that too.
Absolutely. Marty, you've given a lot of yourself, man. I appreciate so much these little or afternoon. I was gonna call it a soiree, but it is for some people out there.
Soiree is fine by me, man. Absolutely.
And there's so many things to pull on. I mean, if we had another hour or so, I would ask you so many questions about the Swedenborgians and their connection to the Tibetans through the. Anyway, there's so many things, but we're gonna talk more.
I can give you the answer now. When you find them, tell me, because I know nothing about that, but I'd like to.
I'll give you a call. It'll be fun. All right.
Absolutely.
All right, guys. Thank you, everybody, for sharing this Sunday afternoon. Thank you, Marty. And till next week, take care.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, guys. Cheers. Now, let's see how we go here.